Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome, both in person and online. I see we have quite a number of participants online. Glad seeing you, and from all over the region. Welcome to panelists, and we'll get to know them better in a few minutes when we introduce the first session. And welcome fellow journalists, experts, scientists, and where they interlock, because I know there's a lot of cross-disciplinary action going on in the media these days, so very happy to see a scientist like Sigoni also doing journalistic duty. We have Khalifa, who is crossing over the technical divide at 5Cs very soon, and others who, Gerard made the crossover some years ago, but he still remains very much one of us. So welcome, everybody. I'm not going to spend too much time on these preliminaries, except that I want to invite Bianca Bedo of Climate Analytics to introduce today's subject and to tell us more about climate analytics. Bianca.
Thanks so much, Wesley. So good morning, Dr. James Fletcher, Climate Envoy for CARICOM, distinguished media and colleagues. I'm Bianca Bedo, Communications Lead for Climate Analytics Caribbean, and it's really such a pleasure to have you all here with us today on behalf of our team and, of course, our partners at the Media Institutes of the Caribbean. Connecting with the media today is genuinely such a pleasure and a privilege for me. When I was growing up, I really wanted to be a journalist. It didn't work out, but I really admire your skills and the importance of the work that you do in just creating a strong and a free society. You have the power to unlock access for fellow citizens by opening a window of information that can elicit change and really transform lives. With great power comes great responsibility, so we really appreciate you taking the time and the initiative to be here with us today to expand your knowledge on the issues that are most critical to the Caribbean with regard to our safety and our sustainable development. So, indulge me a little bit. I just want to share with you on Climate Analytics Caribbean and the work that we do, and maybe you'll understand why knowledge sharing in these spaces is so important to us. So Climate Analytics Caribbean is committed to empowering our region with knowledge-based resources to advance climate action. Our parent company, Climate Analytics, was formed in 2008 to help achieve a climate-safe, sustainable future. Our experts around the world deliver cutting-edge scientific analysis to support and accelerate climate action and to limit warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Key to this is supporting those most affected by climate change, those most vulnerable to the impacts. Our founder thought, if one of our main focuses is to support small island developing states, it would make sense to open an office there, led by experts homegrown in the Caribbean. And so in 2022, Climate Analytics Caribbean was born. We are proud to represent the region from Trinidad and Tobago. Our aim is to really enhance the knowledge-based resources with small island developing states and least developed countries. These are skills and knowledge resources that they really need to augment their negotiations internationally and with regard to policy to really achieve the change for people on the front lines who are suffering the most from climate change. Some of our recent projects have included Re-Energize Caribbean, which was aimed to identify opportunities for clean energy adoption and encourage commitment to a sustainable future through a voluntary clean energy transition pledge. Flood Adapt TT, which aims to enhance communities' understanding of flooding, especially extrapolating the risks under future climate change scenarios and bolstering the data around that. Island Advancement. This raised awareness of how the global issue of loss and damage directly impacts the Caribbean and providing much needed updated data. The Justice, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Project advanced our work on just transition, adaptation and loss and damage to address the gap between regional actors and the global climate process. The Climate Governance Initiative for the Caribbean facilitated the implementation of the Paris Agreement with the development of a legal framework for Caribbean climate governance. So the aim here was to enable more ambitious climate action for the Caribbean and to empower citizens to hold our governments more accountable. Finally, we had the Islands All In for the GST project, which raised awareness for the first global stocktake cycle. And we have a beautiful ambassador for the GST project, Siguni. Thank you, Siguni. Underscoring its importance to our region and facilitating the achievement of an effective GST. We also did school competitions to engage youth and a documentary where we traveled. We did work in Trinidad and Tobago as well as St. Lucia and Dominica to highlight indigenous practices and to show the impacts that are common throughout our region. So, from all this, you can understand why knowledge sharing and helping people within the region better understand climate impacts is so crucial to us. Now, we know that climate change has been around always. What we are concerned with is human-induced climate change, which is the cause of increased greenhouse gas emissions. And this significantly warms our planet and hastens really devastating impacts such as sea level rise, flooding, fisheries loss, agricultural decline, and many more. These escalating impacts are threatening our lives and livelihoods right now. This is not a future problem. As the media, you are the main instrument that can protect our people with information, and there are so many important stories to tell. Now, climate change became kind of cool to report on when people like Greta Thunberg were front and center. However, we have so many extraordinary people within our own region who champion the climate reporting for decades. I see some of you here, and of course, we're very pleased to have the esteemed Wesley Gibbings, who you will hear from later this afternoon. Our leaders in the region were transforming the international climate change landscape, giving voice to our small island developing states, and spearheading the charge for a safer global warming temperature limits, which the highest court in the world enshrined last year. The Caribbean was very much at the forefront of that. We made history. One of these leaders is Dr. James Fletcher, who we are honored to have as a presenter this morning. Today, our Caribbean climate journalists and negotiators are critical to the global process, giving voice to the world's most vulnerable and providing that moral authority. Because indeed, we did not cause the climate crisis, yet we are the ones most severely impacted. So, you'll see that the story of the Caribbean and climate change is 100% one of climate justice. We who are striving for sustainable development are continuously set back by debilitating storms and having to respond to climate impacts with our very limited funds. Many of our islands are trapped in a debt cycle. The injustice is crystal clear. This is why we have to continue to call attention to these matters and expand our reporting of it, offering pathways to progress and hope. Do not get discouraged because we are small. We are small, but we are mighty. And we are at the forefront of change. At the UN negotiations on climate change, it is the small island developing states who can be counted on to rally for what is right, playing major roles in achievements such as the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. And as Dr. Fletcher can attest, this was a decades-long fight and a critical step in providing support to the people most affected by climate disasters. From our international leadership to the rich opportunities such as the potential for the renewable energy revolution, which can bring great benefits to the Caribbean, there are so many inspiring stories to share with our people. So finally, I just want to thank you, members of the media, very much for being the voice of the people. Your role is really crucial to ensuring that we are the writers of our own stories and not just footnotes in someone else's history. I know that the news cycle is jammed. I know that limited resources are a continuous struggle. However, I urge you all to continue investigating, continue analyzing, continue to be that voice that we need. Please continue to highlight what is so unique and extraordinary about our people, our lands, our seas. And I do think that your reporting can be a catalyst for change and really help to transform our future and really help make sure that the region not just survives but thrives. So thank you so much, and I look forward to a really enriching session.
Thank you very much for that, Bianca, and especially since you've left so little for me to add, except to say that the Media Institute of the Caribbean is very pleased for this collaboration with climate analytics. It comes very naturally because the Media Institute has always promoted the practice of journalism as one that would have immediate value, as a discipline that would have immediate value to the quality of lives of the people of the Caribbean. Now, why do we have to do this yet again? Because both the Media Institute of the Caribbean and the Association of Caribbean Media Workers have been very concerned about the quality of reporting on the climate crisis over the years. In fact, 2003, I was part of a team that put together the very first handbook for the coverage of climate change by Caribbean journalists. I happened to be in Fiji not long after we launched that project, and the Fijians and the South Pacific journalists I interfaced with were all saying, what about us? We need to do this, we need to do this. And everywhere I went, through the IFEX network and other organizations that I work with, people from the journalists from the developing world were saying, here now, we want to be part of this action. What that proved to me is that we were front runners when it came to this in terms of drawing the connection between the work of journalists and the development agenda that was necessary in order to cope with the unfolding climate crisis. 20 years later, we would update that handbook, and we collaborated with scientists throughout the region and put together an updated handbook for the coverage of the climate crisis in the Caribbean. Now, all of this done, and MIC, ACM, other organizations, other groups have done quite a number of interventions when it comes to this. And still, we find ourselves having to explain both to ourselves and to others why this overwhelming concern. When Climate Analytics, through Bianca, approached us, I said, perfect, especially now. And as you will see from my presentation this afternoon, we will be able to make an assessment of how timely this intervention is, and that we have in our company somebody like Dr. Jimmy Fletcher, who has done so much work throughout the years, because the work he is doing, and we have collaborated before, in fact, during the COVID era, Dr. Fletcher was very much a part of the activities we were hosting to promote this idea of the need for journalists to better cover the climate crisis. We'll see that there's this constant overlapping. There's this overlapping, for example, not only of the mere practice of journalism, but journalism as a catalyst for human development and as a catalyst for achieving a higher level of social justice. So in my work as somebody promoting human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, in particular for more than half my professional life in media, it is a very natural fit that the issue of climate justice be so aligned to this whole project to promote greater awareness of the climate crisis and what we as professionals in the Caribbean need to do. I'm not one of those people who talk all the time about any lost generation of nobody and any good old days. I've been in journalism for over 40 years now. I can tell you that what we have now is far more promising, and I say so publicly and without reservation all the time, is far more promising than what existed before. And especially when I look at the cohort, people here, those online, the fact that more of us who are in journalistic practice have the training and experience and exposure of what is happening in the world in such a manner and with such a sensitivity that convening something like today's session finds automatic concern and interest. And I think that is a very good sign. I am not all doomsday when it comes to Caribbean journalism at all, and I'm prepared to go down the road fighting that cause. I posted my newspaper column, which appeared today, in the WhatsApp group, and some of it is there because we are seeing now, particularly as media coming under real pressure, there is a real media viability question to be addressed. We're seeing closures, we're seeing mergers, and we're seeing a continuous decline in the viability of traditional legacy media. And standing as stark contrast to that is the emergence of new channels of news and information that are not always concerned about the professional values that we bring to the discipline of balance, fairness, truthfulness, and most of all, a concern about the human condition. Whether we say it or not, that's what our journalism reflects on a daily basis and throughout the day, a concern about the human condition. If that weren't so, then our journalism would be invalid. It would be meaningless. But what we're seeing emerging now are elements in the communication space that are virtually devoted to undermining and destroying what we have. And we have to continue, we have to keep up the fight to ensure that there is space for professional journalism. Whatever the challenges to traditional legacy media, and they're very serious, very, very serious. Some of us have spoken a lot about this in recent times, and what we all recognize is the fact that the media industry, as we have known it for so many years, is in decline or in transition, depending on how you see it. And one of the major casualties of the decline of the media industry is the practice of professional journalism. In the absence of professional journalism, there is no counter to misinformation and disinformation. And all the packages that you're seeing emerging. Paula and I were speaking on the way down here this morning about the fact that you can recognize who are the people behind a lot of the undermining work, because it's almost like a fixed menu of items on their table, and you can associate it with anti-science and non-science. And that's why it's very heartening to see that journalists with scientific backgrounds are entering the profession at senior levels, and so that they can take to the profession higher professional values when it comes to the reporting of the climate crisis. So as for today's exercise, I think it's a very important intervention, and climate analytics needs to be congratulated for it. Very stated up front are the main objectives, which is to strengthen journalists' understanding of climate change and associated politics. Very, very interesting. And Dr. Fletcher, I'm sure, will spend some time on that. This close relationship between the political dynamic and the struggle to come to terms with the climate crisis. Strengthen the way we contextualize our climate crisis reporting. What is the context? What is the reality within which we exist that we are expected now to convey news and information relevant to the climate crisis and all its features? Dissect the climate crisis challenge in terms of issues of loss and damage, the just transition, and all these terms that are becoming in vogue and very fashionable in climate change circles, but about which we need to know much more, because these are very real challenges, day-to-day challenges that we need to address. And I just want to close going back to the whole question of this menu of destruction and undermining of what we do, to say that there is proven science on most of this, all of it, most of it. I know that scientists argue about different things, and Bianca raised a key issue. which is, and the long word for it is the anthropogenic nature of what's happening when it comes to climate change, that is proven science. I don't know why people are still trying to cover that terrain. Nothing wrong with journalistic skepticism, and we need to be skeptical about everything and to challenge what we're seeing before us. But when there is proven science, then I think we need to move on and to expand on what is already known by telling stories, by telling our stories. So I'm going to end my little sermon there and invite Ryan to come up now to introduce our panelists for the next subject, which is the climate justice angle. So, Ryan?
Thanks, Wesley. You gave a lovely prelude to Dr. James Fletcher, who is the CARICOM climate envoy these days, but really and truly he holds many other titles and many other important titles in the sphere of climate change. Dr. Fletcher is the former Minister for Public Service, Sustainable Development and Energy, Science and Technology in St. Lucia. He led the Caribbean's delegation to the negotiations on the Paris Agreement in 2015 and was an integral part of the region's 1.5 to Stay Alive climate change civil society advocacy campaign. Dr. Fletcher served as chairman of the CARICOM Regional Task Force on Sustainable Development and the Regional Coordinating Committee on Climate Change. He is the chairman of the executive board of the Caribbean Center for that was 2022. He's the former chairman of the executive board of the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, the director of Solaricon, and is also the founder of the Caribbean Climate Justice Project, which has been key in developing not only journalists in the Caribbean who cover climate justice, but also developing projects across the Caribbean. So without further ado, Dr. James Fletcher.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Ryan, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. Morning. Let's try it again. Morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the Media Institute of the Caribbean. As Wesley intimated, this is my, third, fourth time collaborating with the Media Institute of the Caribbean. But thankfully, and maybe a little disappointingly, my first time in person, because all the previous times we've done it virtually. A lot of it started during the COVID era, which actually explains why it was virtual. But I want to congratulate MIC for the excellent work that you've been doing in this area, for your commitment to reporting and developing journalistic capacity to report on climate impacts, but also not just climate impacts as they appear on the surface, but delving down much more deeply into what really are those impacts, what are the causes of those impacts, and what are the implications of those impacts, which I'll go into in a little bit of detail in my presentation. So it really is a pleasure to be here with you. I want to thank Climate Analytics, an organization I've been collaborating with since 2012. My first COP as a minister was the Doha COP in 2012. And I remember meeting Bill Hare, the CEO of Climate Analytics. Underneath, anybody who was in Doha would know there was a big spider in the middle of, a big spider statue in the middle of the COP, and that was where Bill and I first met, and we've had a collaboration both personally and institutionally since then, and Climate Analytics has been responsible for a lot of the work, the technical work that has backstopped the advocacy and negotiation of small island developing states. So thank you, Climate Analytics, for that. And as Bianca said, I was really pleased when the Caribbean office was established, because it allowed Climate Analytics to focus directly on climate impacts for the Caribbean. So it's a pleasure to be here with you, journalists, editors, and media professionals from across our region. Journalists play an extraordinarily important role in shaping how societies understand major climate challenges and major global challenges. And there is perhaps no issue today where that role is more important than in the case of climate change. And I hope that by the end of my presentation, you actually agree with that statement, because I know there are so many competing issues for space in that very important real estate that is a newspaper page, or that time on a radio broadcast, the radio news or the TV news. But, and there's so many things. I mean, I see it in my country, St. Lucia, where, there's so many things that compete with climate, but I hope that you will agree with me by the end of this that there probably is no more important thing than climate change. So this morning I want to talk about how climate change can be reported through a climate justice lens and why that approach is particularly relevant for the Caribbean. So let me begin with a simple but powerful fact. The entire Caribbean contributes less than 1/4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Let that sink in. Less than 1/4%. I think the figure is actually less than 1/5%. Yet our region is among those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Across our islands, we are already seeing stronger and more destructive hurricanes. Back in a period of maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, to get hit by a Cat 5 hurricane, a Category 5 hurricane, was a rarity. Now, almost every year, we have Category 5 hurricanes to contend with, and more than one in a season. We also have a very scary phenomenon of how quickly these hurricanes intensify. A few years ago, Hurricane Otis went from a tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane that slammed into Acapulco, Mexico in the space of 12 hours. So consider this. You are preparing, your Met offices tell you that there will be a tropical storm impacting your island, that you should take necessary precautions, and you prepare for a tropical storm. You'll deal with the winds of less than 75 miles an hour, maybe some rainfall, but nothing too catastrophic. You've been there, done that before. And then 12 hours later, with no forewarning or with very little forewarning, you're hit by a Category 5 hurricane. That's what's happening, because there is just so much energy stored in these oceans, which is where these hurricanes get their power, that intensification happens so very quickly. Rising sea levels, which I believe we are underestimating. In fact, there was a report out recently that said even the baseline that we're using to calculate sea levels is an incorrect baseline, and that these sea levels are rising much faster than scientists have predicted. And that has ominous prospects for small island developing states and low-lying countries like ours in the Caribbean, where everybody is near the coastline. Our entire economic and social juggler is near the coastline. All of our hospitals, our ports, of course, are at the coast, our schools, our road infrastructure, our homes, because we were seafaring people before. Before there were planes, we moved around by boat, so we established communities near the coast. And also in most of our islands, the coast is flat, the interior is hilly. So a sea level rise of 1 or 2 meters, 3 feet or 6 feet, will spell disaster for many of our countries, particularly the low-lying ones like Barbados, like some of the islands in the Bahamas. But think of our neighbors in the Pacific, countries like Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Fiji. Some of these countries, the highest point is 1, 2 meters above sea level. So you're talking about if you have a 2 meter sea level rise, the entire country will be inundated. The entire island will disappear. Coral reef degradation, we're already seeing quite a bit of that. Prolonged droughts in my own country, St. Lucia, and Trinidad also looks very dry right now. We're experiencing a drought. This is the beginning of the dry season. We're only in March. We still have April and May to contend with. And we already have the phenomenon of farmers abandoning their vegetable farms, schools having to be closed because there is no water and you can't guarantee the personal hygiene of students. These are the things that we have to deal with, and growing threats to food security and water supply. And the one thing that I don't think we pay enough of, and if my friend Dr. James Hospitalis was in this room, he'd be the first to raise his hand and point out the impact of climate on health and so many, very many different ways. This heat that we're experiencing, people being subjected to heat stress, people not hydrating themselves sufficiently and end up with kidney problems. The impact of extreme weather events on your own emotional well-being. I worked in Dominica for 6 months after the passage of Hurricane Maria, and I can tell you PTSD from a hurricane is real. There were people who I interviewed because I was working on establishing the Climate Resilience Execution Agency of Dominica, CREED. So I had to interview quite a number of people, and some people broke down crying when they were talking to me. And this was an event that happened a year earlier. But also during those 6 months I lived in Dominica, every time a weather event was approaching, people immediately got anxious, people got nervous, and you could tell that that was because they were reliving what had happened not too long ago. And these are things that we don't really pay sufficient attention to. So for the Caribbean, climate change is not an abstract scientific discussion. It is a daily development challenge affecting economies, livelihoods, and communities. The climate crisis is a force multiplier. It worsens poverty, it erodes resilience, it threatens national development trajectory, and increasingly it is raising questions about the long-term viability of some small island developing states. So to illustrate this reality, let me recall one event that many of us, and I just spoke about, remember vividly. In 2017, Hurricane Maria devastated the island of Dominica. Now, Hurricane Maria hit Dominica 2 years after Tropical Storm Erica impacted Dominica. That tropical storm caused damage that was equivalent, I think, to 90% of that country's GDP. It completely devastated a community called Petit Savan, and that entire community had to be relocated. And then 2 years later, in 2017, Hurricane Maria comes along. The damage was estimated at 226% of Dominica's GDP. So consider this. You are a country doing relatively well, and then in the space of 24 hours, over 2 years of productive output of your country is wiped off by a hurricane. Entire communities were destroyed. Infrastructure collapsed. Years of development progress were wiped out almost instantly. And that is the scale of risk that climate change is amplifying across our region. The chart that you're looking at shows the extent of damage that Caribbean countries have suffered from hurricanes. So in the BVI, Hurricane Irma caused damage that was equivalent to over 300% of that country's GDP. In Jamaica, Gilbert was 65%. Just recently, Hurricane Melissa, I have not calculated what the impact is on Jamaica's GDP, but it has been estimated that the damage and losses from Hurricane Melissa are somewhere in the vicinity of $9 billion. Now, a lot was made of the fact that Jamaica received the payout from the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility that came up to, I think, $91 million. And from the catastrophe bond, I think they got another $150 million. So that's good. 150 million plus 90 million, that's 240. But the damage that they have to deal with is $8 to $9 billion. So you could see the magnitude of scale there, and the fact that what this will cause is for the country to go into debt. In fact, I was reading something recently of all the great support that has been given. And it is great support. I mean, there's a little bit of sarcasm in my voice, but it is great support that has been given to the government of Jamaica by the World Bank and by IDB and others. But what is that? It's loans. These are loans that the government of Jamaica has to now take on to recover. And then we criticize these countries for having high debt to GDP ratios without looking at the fact that a lot of that debt they're carrying is because they constantly have to be borrowing to recover and repair from extreme weather events. And not just the sexy extreme weather events, you know, the ones that get reported in the news, but the flooding, the droughts, all of these things have a significant impact on GDP. So, as I said, you know, things like the localized flooding. But climate change is also causing species extinction and ecosystem loss, which is not being reported, which is not being covered, which is not being measured even by our national accounting systems. So we are not even capturing as a government when we go to the international community and say we need money to recover from a hurricane, or we need money to deal with the impacts of climate change. We are not counting things like that have a very serious impact on the viability of our country, on food security, on the tourism product that we're putting out. These are all things that, again, need a lot more diving into, a lot more unlayering so that we can see exactly what are those impacts of climate change. To understand why this is happening, we need to look briefly at the global climate situation. This is a time lapse of how temperatures have been increasing over the years. And the more orange it gets is the hotter the planet is getting. And you can see what has been happening. I mean, but it gets a little bit more scary as we approach the 1990s. So this is where we were in 2022. But 2024, as I'll come to in a while, was the hottest year ever. So if we had to do this graph, then if we had to do that time lapse all the way to 2025, you'll see that it has become even more red. Scientific assessments show that the Earth has already warmed by approximately 1.3 to 1.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So, scarily, the last time our planet was this warm was between 2.6 and 3 million years ago. The last time we were this warm was between 2.6 and 3 million years ago. Carbon dioxide levels were similar to what they are now, but ominously, sea levels were between 10 and 25 meters higher than they are right now. As I said, the year 2024 was the hottest year that we've ever recorded globally, and the last 10 years have been the hottest ever. So every year it keeps getting hotter. I remember saying to the Caribbean Association of Bankers in a meeting in, I think it was in Miami a couple of years ago, that as hot as you think this summer is, this will probably be the coolest summer that you'll experience for the rest of your life. Because we're in a warming trend. It will not get cooler. Based on current global policies, the world is still on track for roughly 2.5 to 3 degrees warming by the end of the century. For large continental countries, that would be extremely disruptive. But for small island developing states like ours, it will be catastrophic. Which is why the Caribbean countries have long argued that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is essential. For us, 1.5 degrees is not just a number, it is a survival threshold. And please, don't let anyone tell you, well, 1.5, 2, there really isn't much of a difference. There is. There's a major difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius warming and 2 degrees Celsius warming. It's like saying to a parent who's dealing with a fever in a child that, yeah, 95 degrees, 97 degrees, no big difference. Yeah, big difference. And the warmer you stay in that period, the more damage, as it is with the human body, you will have with your own internal organs, and as it is with our planet, which is something that we forget, a living ecosystem, a biological ecosystem, a large ecosystem. You have feedback loops. So when something happens here, it affects this, and this affects something else, and then it comes back and it affects this. So for example, when we have more heating and it warms the poles, the North Pole and the South Pole, and that ice starts melting, that ice now starts exposing a dark permafrost, and that dark permafrost, which is replacing what that white snow was, is now absorbing even more heat and now accelerating the warming. Go outside in a black shirt and go outside in a white shirt in the middle of the day, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. So many of you will remember the global campaign initiated by Caribbean civil society known as 1.5 to Stay Alive. This campaign was championed by small island developing states. It was actually born here in Trinidad. I was on my way to a quoted meeting in Ghana, and I met up with now a good friend of mine, now unfortunately deceased, Yves Renard, who was heading Panos Caribbean at the time, and at one point headed Canary. And Yves asked me, you know, why are we not bringing in civil society in the negotiations? Why is it only government that's involved and only the public sector? And I said, Yves, that's an excellent point. So he had this idea to form a civil society movement to give support to the negotiators, and that's where 1.5 to Stay Alive, that whole civil society campaign was born in, I think it was like January, February of 2015. So civil society has always played a major role in advocacy. I can tell you that the work of Caribbean journalists was extremely significant for us leading up to the negotiations in Paris, but even more so the work of civil society like the Caribbean Youth Environment Network and others in helping to bring across to the general public in a way that negotiators cannot what climate change means. Negotiators are really, really bad, and I say so with all due respect to people like Carlin and others in this room, but we are not good communicators. We're not always good communicators. We speak in acronyms that cause your eyes to glaze over really, really quickly. You know, it's very easy to just get lost 5 minutes into a technical presentation because you hear about gigatons of CO2 and GHG and all these things, and you kind of start losing track of what's what. So what we're good at is doing the technical stuff and negotiating in the international fora. What we need people like yourselves to do is to take that and put it in a manner that is digestible, that is palatable, and people can understand. And that was what was missing. You don't always have technical people who are good communicators. So we are now at the point where we will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. So really the issue is by how much and for how long. And that is really the fight right now, because what we are trying to do is to limit the extent of that warming and the duration of that warming, and hopefully get us to the point where by the end of this century, we can get back down to 1.5. So it's not an irreversible loss. The world's current climate commitments are not sufficient to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. The gap between commitments and science require and what science requires is what is referred to as an ambition gap. We need to accelerate ambition. We need more ambition so that we can get to 1.5. Where we are right now with the nationally determined contributions, the commitments that these countries have made to bring their emissions down is not enough. And the next few years, particularly the period leading up to 2030, will be critical in determining whether the world can close that gap and whether small island developing states like ourselves will have a long-term future that we can look forward to. As it is right now, I'll tell you no. If we stay on the track that we are right now, we will not do it. So we need an acceleration and an intensification of ambition and commitment by developed countries. Which brings us to the question of climate justice. What is climate justice? Well, climate justice can best be understood, I think, by answering three simple questions. First, who caused the problem? The majority of greenhouse gas emissions have historically come from large industrialized economies. Secondly, who suffers the most severe impacts? Ironically, the countries that are facing the greatest risks are the ones that have contributed the least to the problem, small island developing states, least developed countries. And thirdly, who should pay for the solutions? Climate justice argues that the people most responsible for the problem should play a leading role in financing the solutions. But these questions are central to international climate negotiations. And when we talk about financing, it is the nature of that finance also. You can't come with a baseball bat or a cricket bat or a 2x4 and break my knees, break my legs, and then say to me that I have to borrow money from you for the surgery to repair the damage, for the cast that will immobilize my legs whilst they're healing, and for the crutches that I will need to move around during that period. And also, you're not going to give me any compensation for all of the downtime that I'm losing and I can't work. Well, that is really what is happening right now, because the countries are saying to us, yeah, we can make money available to you, but you have to borrow it from us. The majority of the funding we're receiving is not in the form of grants. So where's the justice in that? Where's the justice in someone causing a problem, inflicting that problem on you, and then saying that you have to borrow money from me for you to be able to isolate or insulate yourself from that problem? And there's a caveat. I will not stop doing what I'm doing. So your legs will be broken again, and we'll repeat that cycle again and again, and every time you have to borrow more money from me. So when we talk about climate justice in its simplest form, that's basically what we're talking about. And these questions are central to our negotiations, but they're also very important questions for journalists like yourself who are covering climate stories. For small island developing states, climate impacts are now not only environmental, but they are profoundly economic. Recovering from a single major hurricane can cost more than half of a country's annual GDP, as I showed earlier. Repeated climate disasters increase national debt and place enormous strain on public finances. Governments are forced to divert resources from development priorities such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure in order to rebuild after a hurricane or any major event. So the government of Jamaica right now has to be borrowing money to put into recovering communities like St. Elizabeth, when that money would have been better spent in education, in healthcare, in food security, in water security. So all of these things now have to be not put on the back burner so much, but de-emphasized as they recover the island, because you can't have schooling in a place if people are still living in shelters and don't have water. This economic imbalance between responsibility and impact is one of the clearest examples of climate injustice. For many years, climate stories about vulnerable countries were largely framed as appeals for help. For example, a story might say, small island states need assistance to recover from climate disasters. We have to change that narrative, and climate justice allows us to reframe that story. It asks a deeper question. Who bears responsibilities for the damages being experienced? Instead of framing the issue as charity, climate justice frames it as accountability. This shift in narrative is very important to journalism. It encourages reporting that examines not only the impacts of climate change, but also the policies, the economic systems, and the historical factors that contributed to those impacts. Although Caribbean countries are small and highly vulnerable, they have played a significant role in shaping global climate policy, as Bianca said earlier. The 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign is a very powerful example. The fight to get loss and damage, recognized in the Paris Agreement as a separate element and not part of adaptation, is also another very powerful example. I can tell you, when we were negotiating Paris, the number of developed countries who came to me and said, there is no such thing as loss and damage. It's just adaptation in a different, framed differently, and they could not not see why we were pursuing loss and damage, because they did not understand that there were some impacts of climate change that were irreversible. When you have ocean acidification, because your oceans have been forced to absorb so much carbon dioxide that the pH, the acidity of the ocean has changed, that is irreversible. Unlike yourself, when you have an upset stomach, you could take Tums or Maalox or something. You can't drop Tums in the ocean to neutralize the acidity. So how is that? How do we adapt to that? When a hurricane passes and it destroys a community and lives are lost, how do you adapt to lives being lost? We're not even quantifying the lives that have been lost, but how do you adapt to that? You know, how do you adapt to sea level rise that has now taken away a big part of your country? A part that existed before, the sea, the shoreline has moved in because you now have sea level rise that has taken up a few meters, a few hundred meters. There's no adaptation to that, and that is what loss and damage speaks to. It speaks to those irreversible impacts. And it was because of the advocacy of small island developing states, particularly those in the Caribbean, that we have loss and damage as a separate element recognized in the Paris Agreement. Then, through coordinated diplomacy and advocacy, small island states succeeded in placing the 1.5 degree goal at the center of the Paris Agreement. And I am fortunate to have been one of those persons because I chaired the negotiations, I co-chaired the negotiations together with the minister from Norway that led to 1.5 degrees Celsius being accepted as the long-term temperature goal and the ambition of the Paris Agreement. But we also worked very hard to get a distinct fund for responding to loss and damage. Again, when there was such a fight, small island developing states were the ones at the forefront of that. So this demonstrates that even small countries can exercise significant influence in international negotiations. It also illustrates something very important. Moral authority can shape global policy. Another important shift in the narrative for you is recognizing that the Caribbean is not only vulnerable, it is also innovative. Our region has pioneered several global solutions. For example, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. That was created as the world's first multi-country disaster insurance pool. And earlier I spoke about the payout that it made to the government of Jamaica. The Bridgetown Initiative, led by Barbados, has helped spark global discussions on reforming international financial institutions to better support climate resilience. What international financial institutions like the World Bank are saying to us now is because of our success, quote unquote, in having higher GDP per capita now. So we are now classified as higher middle income countries. So because we are higher middle income countries, we are not eligible for concessional and grant financing. Now, how does that make sense? First of all, even the countries that have higher GDP per capita, there is still a lot of inequity in those countries. So if you look at the Gini coefficient, which is used to measure equality in a country, you'll see that there's still a lot of inequity. So the GDP per capita is being influenced by a small group at the top and a small level of productivity, but there is still significant vulnerability within that country. And you cannot now equate the vulnerability of a country to its GDP per capita, and that's what the Bridgetown Initiative is trying to change. And many Caribbean countries are leading efforts in nature-based solutions, such as restoring mangroves and coral reefs to protect ecosystems. These are the nature-based solutions that we talk about, doing things. You know, mangroves are important they serve as buffers, they prevent, when there's storm surge, they prevent that storm surge from getting on shore. They serve as filters to prevent silt when there is landslides from getting into the oceans. They're a good spawning area for many marine species. These are things that we've been working on. And these examples show that the Caribbean is not just a victim of climate change, it is also a laboratory for solutions. Another major development in recent years has been the growing role of law in climate accountability, The International Court of Justice has recently clarified that states have important obligations under international law to prevent climate harm. This has important implications. First of all, climate justice is no longer simply a political argument. It increasingly has a legal dimension. For journalists like yourselves, this means that climate reporting can also examine how governments and corporations are fulfilling or failing to fulfill their legal responsibilities. And mind you, it's not just international governments, it's your own local governments. If your own local governments are allowing developments that are damaging the environment or that are working against what they committed to doing in their climate commitments, then that is something that you have to report on at your peril, but you still have to report on it. Because the ICJ's opinion does not just hold the big corporations and developed countries accountable, it holds our own countries and governments accountable. Earlier I made mention of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. This fund recognizes that some climate impacts cannot be prevented through mitigation or adaptation. In those countries In those cases, countries suffering the consequences should receive financial support. However, important questions remain. How much funding should be mobilized? The Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage right now has commitments of, I think, $700 million US dollars. That's what has been committed to the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. Now, that might sound like a big number, right? But the actual need for loss and damage financing is in the tune of $400 billion every year. So that $700 million that the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage has is not even 1/10 of what Jamaica would need to recover from Hurricane Melissa. Again, where's the justice? Do you know how much money is being spent on this war effort that's going on in the Middle East right now? So when they tell you that they don't have money, you just have to look at where the money is being spent. Who will receive this funding, and how quickly will support reach vulnerable communities? These are critical issues that journalists can investigate and report on. So climate reporting has to move beyond the weather. Traditionally, climate coverage in many newsrooms focuses primarily on weather events, particularly extreme weather events. Storms, floods, and droughts dominate headlines. But climate journalism can and should go deeper and further. There are 3 levels of climate reporting. First, event reporting, which covers the disaster itself. Secondly, context reporting, which connects events to climate science. And thirdly, accountability reporting, which examines the policies, the investments, and the decisions that influence climate risk. So if a government has allowed a development to take place on a beach, a major hotel to build on a beach in the same area that we know will be inundated from storm surge and sea level rise, then yes, we have to report on the fact that this hurricane has caused significant damage to that hotel. But why was that hotel allowed to be built there in the first place? Why did we allow an entire community? In my country, St. Lucia, we had some major flooding 3 years ago in the north of the island in 2 communities called Grand Riviere and Riviere Mita. If any one of you in this room can speak Creole, you will know that Grand Riviere means big river, Riviere Mita means in the middle of the river. So what we did, in our wisdom and our brilliance, is that we decided we would retrain the river, get it to go somewhere else, and build nice, big, middle-income communities in there. But when rainfall comes down, it goes through the path of least resistance, which is where it has always gone through. So it doesn't matter what you call your community or whether you think you've retrained the river, that's where it'll go. When you clear a mangrove for you to put a marina, and now you have significant damage there because you've cleared that mangrove and put, so yes, climate change has caused it, but who has exacerbated it? That's part of the reporting that has to be engaged in. So climate stories have to exist across many different reporting beats because climate change intersects with almost every area of public life. For example, health reporting. As I said earlier, climate change affects heat stress and disease patterns. In agriculture, it affects rainfall patterns and crop yields. In tourism, it influences coral reef health and coastal erosion. In economics, it influences and affects insurance markets and national debt. What do you think is happening to insurance premiums in our region as they continue to suffer losses because of these hurricanes that are hitting high-value infrastructure along our beach? Premiums will go up, and they won't just go up for the hotels, they'll go up for you and me. So journalists who apply a climate lens to these topics can uncover powerful and important stories. So allow me to conclude with a very simple reflection. The Caribbean did not create the climate crisis, we know that. But the Caribbean has played an important role in shaping the global response. And Caribbean journalists, like yourselves, have a critical role to play as well. By reporting climate change through a justice lens, you can help ensure that vulnerable communities are heard because they are not being heard. Our vulnerable communities who are suffering, our women, particularly our single mothers, who when a hurricane hits and there is no water, they're the ones who have to go and trek miles to get water to bring back to the house and deal with everything else and deal with the fact that school is out because some of the schools are being used as shelters so the child can't go back to school. So if the child can't go back to school, you have to find some way of dealing with that child. These are all the things that particularly women have to deal with that are not being reported. That people who suffer from chronic diseases, when a hurricane strikes an island and the grid is down, if you are insulin dependent, you may die because there is no refrigeration to keep your insulin refrigerated and you will go into diabetic shock. Or if you are taking dialysis 2 or 3 times a week and the road from your home to that dialysis center is impassable because of a landslide and nobody knows that you live there, so clearing that road is not a priority for the government because there are many important roads like the roads leading to the tourist resorts and the roads leading to the airports that have to be cleared. You will die because a week without dialysis will cause you to die. These are all things that we have to look at, and that these are all stories that have to be addressed. But when you report on these things, global accountability is also strengthened, and the realities facing small island states are clearly understood. So I hope I've done a reasonable job in convincing you that climate change is not just a story about weather. It is a story about justice, it is a story about responsibility, and it is a story about the future of our region. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
I think there's a Q&A.
Yes.
Yes.
So there's another microphone. Great. So can you just pass it to Joel? Joel? No, so the online people can capture your question.
Right, so I was interested when you said that the loss and damages are not about adaptation. So you talked about how, like in Jamaica, they have to rebuild. But I'm still not absolutely clear that I understand what is the loss and damage fund supposed to be for. So it's not about like building more resilient homes then? That's not what we're talking about.
That is adaptation.
Right, so could you explain in more
So the
detail?
loss and damage fund is to help you to respond to those impacts that are non-reversible. So things like a hurricane strikes a country, how do you recover from that? Addressing those impacts like that. Insurance, for example, insurance that will help mitigate those losses. So if we're talking adaptation, if we're talking building resilience in your bridges, building resilience somewhere else, that is an adaptation measure. But those things that are beyond adaptation, that is where the loss and damage fund comes in. So precisely that. So for example, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, capitalizing that so that if there is major event in a country, that Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, or one that exists in the Pacific, can help that country rebound and respond more quickly.
You
Yes.
need to use the microphone because we have people online.
Like give money for fishermen to buy back their boats if their boats are destroyed.
Correct.
Could you just give us two other examples of how the loss and damage fund would work? So I can understand like you replace the fisher boats, but a couple of examples.
Insurance, providing insurance. I can't really tell you, I can't give you examples because the loss and damage fund is still being formulated. They're still working out the modalities of the loss and damage fund. One of the things they've just come up with is the BIM, the Barbados implementation modalities, that is looking at the areas in which rapid response, rapid assistance can be given. So a community wanting to respond, a community needing to recover quickly, that is something that can happen. A school needing to be rebuilt as a result of a hurricane, a health center, a community needing to be. So it is in response to one of these, to an event that cannot be covered from adaptation. However, if you want to strengthen the resilience of your schools or your health systems before impact, that is adaptation. But responding to the impact itself is a loss and damage response. No problem.
And so I just want to add to that because there was a press release from the CCJ only yesterday, which has it that the president of the CCJ is proposing the establishment of an international climate injuries compensation fund. So this looks at the issue of injury to humans.
Yeah. And one of the areas, unfortunately, that I don't think we've covered, which I spoke about earlier, is damage to ecosystems. You know, who is responsible and who's paying for the damage to our ecosystems as a result of some of these extreme weather events? And that is something I think that has to be addressed also.
Thanks, Dr. Fletcher. Thanks, Wesley. Doc, I think you made a key point about the insurance industry, and that's one understudied in my opinion, and one that's underreported on in our context in the Caribbean. One of the things that I'd like to ask you though, we know that premiums will go up, but have you seen instances where insurance companies are now no longer willing to cover certain communities or countries in this region because of the vulnerability?
I haven't seen it yet, but I'm sure the insurance association can tell you that that is a matter that they're grappling with. That the cost, and it may not just be refusing to cover, Ryan, but it could be that the cost of premiums will make it prohibitive for you to even take out a premium. So I mean, there are different ways of saying we won't cover you. I can say, okay, I'll cover you, but it'll cost $10 million. And I can't afford to give you $10 million. So I think there are all these things that are playing out. And the deeper we delve into the impacts of climate change and the worse these impacts get, I think is the more this question will become a real one that has to be dealt with, particularly by our hotel sector. Because I read some time ago that was something that they were beginning to grapple with. Not so much insurance companies saying that they would not insure, but the cost of the premiums was making it prohibitive for them to insure. Yeah.
Now, I propose to come to that during my presentation because in our visits to St. Elizabeth and Black River, etc., in Jamaica post-Melissa, one of the things that I wanted to find out is the insurance question. Now, the Montego Bay Business Chamber sort of covers all of that area, even though it's lower down south. And most of the members of the Montego Bay Chamber of Commerce do not have insurance because the premiums are prohibitive. And much less if you talk about the residents of those areas. Insurance is not a factor.
I'm happy you raised that, Wesley, because in response to the first question, that is something that I've also been advocating for, that what CRIF does, it's a parametric insurance facility. So it means that they don't go in and do an assessment of what kind of damage you've experienced. Once certain triggers have been met, so for example, X amount of rainfall or wind that exceeded a particular mile per hour threshold, they will pay out because they know that damage will ensue as a result of that. But that is only to governments. That goes to the Treasury so that the government can recover. But what happens to the person on the ground? What happens to the people who are not insured or underinsured and who need to bounce back? There really is no facility for them. So I've been speaking both to the CEO of the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, and that's Mr. Isaac Anthony, who assured me that is something that they're looking at. But also, every time I've spoken, I've also made the point that we have to look at parametric microinsurance so that we can provide insurance at that level, at the household level, so that the farmers, the fishers, the households that are impacted by these extreme weather events can also get a payout because we know that they've been impacted. We don't need to go in and do an assessment, and you can see in St. Elizabeth what has happened. So if there was a facility, again funded by the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, that says that if there is damage, that the people and the livelihoods in those communities will be compensated to this amount, then that is one tangible and very relevant way of using the funds from the FRLD for helping people bounce back. But that can't happen if we're talking $700 million in pledges. We need a lot more money than that. But that is certainly something, parametric microinsurance, because the community in the Caribbean, the number of people who have insurance is a small fraction of the number of people who need insurance. Most of our communities, most of our households are not insured in the Caribbean. That's an unfortunate fact of life.
Okay, Khalifa, and then we have an online question.
Okay, thanks very much, Wesley. So my question is, because we talked a little bit about the economic impacts and that kind of loss, I'm wondering, is there a mechanism that addresses cultural and traditional loss of cultural tradition? I think about St. Vincent and the Grenadines and Hurricane Beryl, what happened with Union Island, and that 25% of that population has not returned to Union Island.
Yeah.
That's a loss.
Yeah.
How do you address that?
How do you account for it and how do you value it? And again, that's something that when we talk about under-accounting and non-accounting in our system for the damage caused by climate change, that's one of them, heritage loss. Petit Savan, the government had to relocate the entire community of Petit Savan in Dominica. And it doesn't matter whether you've given me a nicer house. This is where my parents and grandparents, this is where my whole culture, that's where it was located. How do you account for that? How do you deal with that? So that is certainly something that, again, through the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, we are supposed to be addressing, because that is an example of loss and damage, loss of culture, loss of heritage, loss of continuity, and I hate to say it, but loss of lives. How do you deal with loss of lives? Somebody dies, the breadwinner in the family has died. What happens? You just go on? I mean, it's because of people in a developed country with their insatiable need for fossil fuels have caused this crisis, and the one breadwinner in your family has died. And you say, oh boy, that's unfortunate, eh? That can't be the response. But how do you put a value on a life? And how do you help that family that has now been devastated? How do you help them so that they can have some kind of decent standard of living, some decent quality of life, having lost the one breadwinner in the family?
Okay, no, sorry, Joel, we have to move on. But there's an online question. Mm-hmm. It doesn't say who, but I'm sure it's somebody from Pei Baba Lai, St. Lucie.
Okay. I hope it's not in Creole.
Dr. Fletcher, excellent presentation as usual. My question is, what is the difference between the Disaster Vulnerability Reduction Fund and the Loss and Found
Fund for
and Damage Fund, particularly in St. Lucia, considering so much has been done under the DVRP and its tangible impacts?
Okay, so that I think is a great question because it speaks to adaptation, resilience building, and response after disaster. The DVRP, the Disaster Vulnerability Reduction Program, is one that is supposed to do precisely that: reduce disaster vulnerability, increase resilience. So you look at increasing the resilience of health systems in your health centers and your hospitals, your schools, your roads, your bridges. That is supposed to help build resilience. That is very separate from responding to loss and damage, be it cultural loss, be it infrastructure loss, be it any other loss, livelihood loss. That is what the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, and also providing insurance capacity so that you could provide support to those countries. So that's the difference. One is resilience building, which is basically adaptation, and the other one is loss and damage, responding to a disaster.
Thanks a lot for that, and thanks for the cue for the St. Lucian journalists to follow up on the DVRP. Yeah. The question was a much longer one than that, and
I think if I can tease the St. Lucian journalists, I think what they should do is look at the various elements of the DVRP, how is that money spent, and whether we can now say that the funds that went into the DVRP have those funds increase resilience in the places where they were meant to increase resilience. So that's a story, and that's a story for everybody who has had it. I think the DVRP is funded by the World Bank. So any country that has a DVRP, that DVRP is supposed to increase resilience. So has the DVRP in your country done what it was supposed to do? Can you say with certainty that there has been an increase in resilience in those sectors that the DVRP has put money into? My apologies to the Ministry of Finance, who will now be subjected by inquiries from the journalists, but that's your job.
Exactly. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Fletcher.
No problem.
Great. Now we're going to move right ahead. And Joel, you can hold your question. Maybe the next panel will be able to respond. We're going to look at the Caribbean and the global agenda. And we have a recorded presentation from Ruana Haynes, who is Director of Caribbean Climate Analytics, Climate Analytics Caribbean, and then we're going to have a presentation from Sasha Jatan Singh. Ryan, do you want to just give us the profiles of the two presenters? And then we'll proceed.
So I'll start with Ruana first, who is the Director of Climate Analytics Caribbean and Head of Diplomacy at Climate Analytics. Ruana is an international climate law and governance specialist and TEDx 2020 speaker with over 15 years of experience in the UN climate change process. A former Trinidad and Tobago diplomat, Ruana has negotiated for the Caribbean community as well as the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, including in the development of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. At present, she is Head of Diplomacy at Climate Analytics and Director of Climate Analytics Caribbean Office in TNT. Ruana also provides strategic, technical, and diplomatic advice to island states in climate change negotiations and training for officials new to the UN climate process. Ruana holds a Master's in International Legal Studies with distinction from Georgetown University Law Center, Washington, D.C., and a Master's in International Affairs Environmental Policy from Sciences Po in Paris, France. And Sasha is a climate finance and participatory environmental governance professional with over 15 years of experience in the public, international development, and civil society sectors in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. She is currently Senior Adaptation and Loss and Damage Advisor for the Caribbean at Climate Analytics, as well as the Deputy Director of Climate Analytics Caribbean. She co-leads the Access to Finance Working Group of the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance. She is also an Atlantic Fellow for the Social and Economic Equity at the London School of Economics and Political Science. So we'll start with Ruana's prepared presentation.
Okay, and immediately after Ruana Haynes' presentation, we're going to hear from Carlon Mendoza, who is Climate Analytics Caribbean Climate Policy Advisor. He ought to have been in the first round of presentations, but Dr. Fletcher was so interesting, we had to keep that ball rolling. So, let's get in the presentation.
Hello everybody, good morning. My name is Rana Haynes. I am the Director of Climate Analytics Caribbean and the Head of Diplomacy at Climate Analytics. I'm so happy to have the opportunity to speak with you even by video for this very important workshop. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. I had another conflicting event outside of the country, but I'm sure that the event is going well and I look forward to hearing about the outcomes and the outputs. So I have a few minutes with you by video this morning to discuss the critical importance of nationally determined contributions in the context of 1.5 degrees aligned climate action and the critical need for ambitious climate action. So in order to address this as clearly as I can and in the time frame that I've been given, I want to discuss 3 main buckets of issues. The first is, what are nationally determined contributions, or NDCs as we call them? The second is, what is the Paris Agreement ambition cycle? And the third is, why the urgency? So in terms of what are NDCs, to put it simply, NDCs are a communication tool for climate action under the Paris Agreement. In the context of what parties communicate on their NDCs, they must respond to the goals of the Paris Agreement contained in Article 2 of the treaty, specifically as it relates to the goal to limit the increase in average global temperatures to within 1.5 degrees Celsius, which includes achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And so parties initially, many parties were of the view that NDCs should primarily look at mitigation actions to be undertaken by parties in their efforts to address climate change. Since then, and that was about 12 years ago in 2014, when this issue was being negotiated, views have evolved quite a bit, and although there are still some parties that focus on mitigation action exclusively in their NDCs, more broadly, there are overwhelming number of parties that also address adaptation and resilience measures, their financing needs for those measures, as well as loss and damage more recently in the context of what is communicated through their NDCs. So why is this communication tool important, and what does it have to do with the Paris Agreement ambition cycle? To put it simply, the Paris Agreement in its design includes a facility where every 5 years there is a status check on the progress that is being made towards meeting the goals of the agreement. And this process is called the global stocktake. So parties literally take stock of their actions in the previous 5-year cycle and examine those actions in light of how we are collectively tracking towards the goals that were agreed in the context of the Paris Agreement. And they meet at a very high level at a COP to take decisions on how to move forward from where we are. So the first global stocktake took place in 2023, and the report card wasn't very good. Spoiler alert, we are woefully off track as it relates to all of the goals of the Paris Agreement, in particular on this question of limiting warming to within 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so the 2023 outcome of the GST makes certain recommendations to help us to accelerate our efforts and improve our ambition. These include a goal to triple renewable energy by 2030, to strengthen energy efficiency by 2030 in the overall context of transitioning away from fossil fuels, getting rid of harmful fossil fuel subsidies, as well as making a significant impact on reducing methane in particular in our energy systems. And these objectives have been set with a view to accelerating action in the period up until 2030. Additionally, every global stocktake includes a call for parties to submit a new round of nationally determined contributions. In this context, these nationally determined contributions are to cover climate action out to 2035, so beyond the 2030 limit of the objectives that I previously mentioned. And why is this important? This is important because the Paris Agreement goal, especially as it relates to limiting warming to within 1.5 degrees Celsius, is a time-bound goal. It must include parties hitting the point of net zero emissions by mid-century, by 2050. And so it's not a question of having an unlimited number of 5-year cycles in order to get this done. We literally have by mid-century to have made very significant progress that we are not yet on course to make in order to be able to ensure that warming is limited to within 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So this is the context for the urgency, which is my last basket of points. We know and we can see and we have all felt that climate change impacts are accelerating, and they are accelerating as we approach the critical 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, which is part of why we ought not to go beyond this limit, because every increment of warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius will unleash even greater consequences for us globally, but in particular where we feel it the most, which is in our parts of the world. And so it is imperative that we take the most urgent measures now and communicate them through our NDCs within this critical decade, so by 2030, and then looking beyond to the next milestone out to 2035. Climate change is a phenomenon where the changes that take place are multi-decadal or multi-century. So the impacts that we're actually feeling now are as a result of the cumulative effect of the emissions that are already in the atmosphere, that have committed us to the level of warming that we're experiencing today, which is dangerously close to the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, although we have not passed it quite yet, but we are on track to do so. It means then that the emissions that are happening now are committing us to greater multi-year sea level rise that will not be reversed or reversible for centuries. It's committing us to glacier melt that is contributing to this sea level rise, as well as other critical tipping points such as ocean acidification, as our oceans try to absorb the excess greenhouse gases that we are pumping into the atmosphere at alarming rates. We already know that we are almost over the tipping point as it relates to coral reef ecosystems that are experiencing major bleaching and dieback globally, especially where they exist in tropical or warm waters. And so maybe I'll wrap up by saying, I know that it must be hard to find the hope in the context of especially what is going on in the world today, where we have an unlimited amount of emissions being pumped into the atmosphere by war. We have acid rain falling. We have unprecedented flooding taking place in mountainous areas. And we have people dying just based on the heat of the sun, the heat that is in the atmosphere. It is hard to see where we have hope, especially considering that in order to have the best chance of slowing all of this down, we need to act now. To that, I would say we have to focus on what we know. And what we know is that we still have a slim chance, we still have a rapidly narrowing window of opportunity that we need to be able to take advantage of, that we need to be able to focus on. We know that it is still technologically and scientifically feasible to make the progress that needs to be made. We have seen in reality the ways in which renewable energy have come on stream to the extent that they are beginning to compete with fossil fuel sources of energy in terms of affordability and availability in some parts of the world. But there's so much more that needs to be done, and that starts with us as people understanding the scale of the crisis that we're in and pushing our policymakers and governments to do better because we actually know better. So I'll leave it there for now and wish you all the best with today's workshop. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rana. So we'll take in Carlon's presentation. Apologies, Sasha, I know you were expecting to come on after.
Yeah. All right, good morning, everyone. All right. Okay, here we go. All right, so I'm here to speak about the just transition and how the media could report about this. And before I start, I'd say that this is not a political presentation. I've not been sponsored by any party to talk about this, and this does not represent what is currently happening in the country in relation to the opening or reopening of the petroleum refinery. So we've understood the concept of just transition locally before we even, I guess, discussed it or would have been discussing it within the UN system or the UN climate change system. So as you would see, the media has already started reporting about just transition in terms of the struggling of the refinery, the closure of it. They've also reported, and Ryan Beatriu here has also had some articles published about what the COP or the Climate Change Conference has been discussing with terms of just transition. And we even had some elements of the discussion surrounding the communities affected by the closure of this. But the real question is whether this transition or this closure was done in a just, fair, and equitable manner. So that's what we will be discussing today, about what is this just transition. So it is a framework that has been established where we want to see the movement of high carbon, the emissions that we spoke about, are low carbon industry or economy, while protecting the people and livelihoods. So there's no defined or agreed definition of just transition. We have different facets of I guess the space in terms of the labor movement, climate movement, and others discussing this topic of just transition, but there's no one agreed definition. But what we can say is that the goal of this transition is to ensure that no one is left behind, that workers, communities, and countries are carried in terms of this movement in a fair and just manner. And as I said, it originated within the labor, the ILO industry, the International Labour Organization, where before even the closure of Petrotrin, in other developed countries or global north countries, we saw that there was closure of the coal industry and workers being displaced. So this is what the transition or the discussion around this topic came about. So, as I said, this has now moved into a global discussion, and it now particularly is rooted in the climate change space. So the Paris Agreement that Dr. Fletcher spoke about in 2015 embedded the principle of just transition, but it only applied to the workforce, and that was mentioned in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. But in COP27, there was the establishment of the Just Transition Work Program, and this work program was a space where parties can come to discuss topics surrounding this transition, ranging from climate resilience, agriculture, renewable energy, workers, and critical minerals, all topics that affect this transition. And they had a space rooted in this climate change conference to discuss just transition. And that work program is continuing. It's a 3-year work program. As I said, started, that would have been in 2022. and it's up for review this year, whereby countries would decide whether or not they want to continue discussing these topics. But there's also another element of the discussion which talks about a just transition mechanism. That is a facility that was agreed last year in Brazil, which is about to be developed to discuss now the moving forward from talk into action. Now, in terms of having exact plans and policies and legislative frameworks to assist countries in their transition. So the Caribbean context of this, you might ask, why is just transition something that we should be discussing? Because some of the factors are, even though we have Guyana and Suriname, upcoming developing countries with, well, put on record that they are now one of the more growing or most successful or upcoming economy because of their discoveries. And then we have, of course, Trinidad and Tobago. Apart from those three, we are not major fossil fuel producers within this region, and our dependence on fossil fuels is very high compared to other parts of the world. So for us, a transition would have to focus on the resilience of our peoples and our economies and the sustainability of their livelihoods. But this is also linked to climate debt, climate finance, debt and disaster recovery, which was discussed by Dr. Fletcher earlier. So this transition is a justice issue because, again, we can't be seen or be expected to pay for this transition when we would not have caused the issue. And that is where we would want to have the media focusing on that climate justice lens of this transition. So for the Caribbean, we have some priority sectors. This is a non-exhaustive list, but this is some of the top priority areas where we sort of apply the principles of just transition into the energy sector, where we look at expanding our solar, wind, and microgrids, moving off of that dependence on fossil fuels and oil and gas. We also now look to the tourism industry because most of our Caribbean islands are heavily based tourism economies. And then agriculture and fisheries go hand in hand in terms of adopting some techniques, because if we are moving into a renewable space or a low economic space, we want to ensure that the tools that farmers and fishermen use are sustainable and move with the transition, as well as they are able to be reskilled, retrained, and retooled with respect to that movement. So we could just give the basic example of electric vehicles. We have mechanics who normally specialize in servicing our regular fuel-based vehicles. But now we're looking at if we have to increase the uptake of electric vehicles within our societies, do we have enough mechanics and facilities to allow for us to have a smooth transition into that electric space? So that is a question we have to keep asking ourselves. Are we doing enough? So we have some regional challenges with respect to this transition. In terms of climate finance, that's always a challenge. In terms of the sort of fertile land space to attract investors for renewable energy projects, that is something that a lot of investors look at the Caribbean as too small to invest in some large projects. So we have exploration happening in Dominica and even in St. Kitts and some islands where they are much more fertile with geothermal energy. But the question is also, is this a good investment? So these are some of the problems faced by Caribbean countries. We also have outdated energy infrastructure, and we have to look at now, even if we move over onto solar panels and other forms of renewable energy, what is going to happen to these abandoned assets? And that is another question in terms of how we deal with the disposal of these assets. We look at technology dependence and the import costs of that. And as I explained earlier, in terms of the workforce training and public awareness. So those are some of the challenges we face within the region. So even though we face these challenges, we have seen a number of Caribbean governments take up an approach to sort of ensure that this transition is adequately accounted for or represented in their policies and in their frameworks. So in Antigua and Barbuda, there is the Renewable Energy Expansion Roadmap. And I would say Antigua and Barbuda, having done some work there, are very much leading the way with respect to the just transition and in terms of how they support communities. So they even have a program that they allow small businesses and persons or even community centers to come and pitch a project for solar panels and for renewable energy infrastructure. And they give these things at a very much discounted cost to individuals to allow them to move off of the grid. So that is something happening currently in Antigua. In Trinidad and Tobago, for the longest while, we've had a just transition strategy or policy in draft. I believe it has been before cabinet. Again, this is not a political presentation, but it has been before many cabinets. So we have done work, and that was led by Climate Analytics some years ago. But at least we have a carbon reduction strategy where we have that sort of elements or principles being taken up in terms of policy. So some enablers for this transition, we're looking at expanded access to climate finance, and that is linking all the discussions we had before in terms of the financial mechanism within this process, meaning the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and all other local funds, and how those funds can now be applicable to the work that we need to do in this transition. So we want to expand that and also look at different innovative sources of climate finance, whether it be green bonds or debt for climate swaps. We also need to focus on a lot more regional collaboration between and across Caribbean states. We often find that for the region, we work in a lot of silos, and we can definitely learn lessons from other Caribbean countries. As I indicated, that Antigua is doing a lot of work that can be piloted in other countries within the region with respect to the transition. And of course, top of the list, well, not top of this list, but workforce training and green skills development. We have to ensure that the curriculum within our education system now sort of takes that innovative approach with relation to the transition, in relation to how we deal with renewable energy and all the different solutions. And finally, in terms of community-led solutions and participatory government, we have to make sure that civil society forms a very important part within these discussions. You don't want the situation, and as Dr. Fletcher, when we work closely together, so he would always say that you don't want to have a situation where you are now moving into a transition and you're implementing solar panels on someone's roof and their roof cannot accommodate that solar panel. So instead of you thinking to better their circumstance, you end up worsening their situation because the roof collapsed. So we have to now understand the contextual environment that we live in and ensure that in terms of transition, fairness is also part of resilience and building that resilience. So the global action, as I indicated, is that we have an agenda within the Alliance of Small Island States where we want to ensure that this transition is done fairly, quickly, and in line with the 1.5 degree temperature goal. I want to ensure that the access to finance, the technologies that are transferred, and that the debt relief remains central to all these discussions. So you don't want to have a transition and then we have a situation where there's no finance, or you have technology being transferred that no one could use and there's no capacity being developed within our countries to really assist and facilitate that transition. So, to the meat of the matter, how can journalists report on just transition? You have to explain the human impact of the transition. This has to now centralize or focus on jobs, on livelihoods, and communities. So whilst we spoke at the beginning about the closure of Petrotrin and the struggling economy of the struggling situation of the country, did we take time to assess that the communities surrounding Petrotrin, Marabella, Claxon Bay, etc., what happened to those persons who were selling food to the workers? What happened to the little mom and pop shops, that things that would have had a livelihood because of the fact that the industry was there and now it's closed. We also now have to look at the economic opportunities so that this transition is an opportunity for us to move into renewable energy and in green jobs. We also need to investigate rigorously whether this finance is just, whether the policies are applicable, and whether governments are being held accountable. And finally, highlighting how the voices of workers, youth, women, and frontline communities are impacted by this transition. So, some takeaways. You link the Caribbean just transition with climate action and development, and that any energy transformation we're speaking about must move alongside social protection. So, we have that the media plays a central role in explaining this transition to the society as well as holding decision makers accountable. All right, thank you very much.
Alan, so what we're going to do is to take a short break now, and we'll come back with Sasha. Paula Lindo, stop giving trouble. Sigoni, Charlene, stop giving trouble. Okay, as we continue looking at the Caribbean and the global agenda, I want to invite Sasha Jatan Singh up front to present. Come, Isabella, stop making noise in the back, please.
I can't see anything. Okay, great. So, good day, everyone, and it's a real, pleasure to be here, where we're going to actually, we've been focusing on one thing, really on how can we advance reporting of climate change in a climate justice context here in the Caribbean. And Dr. Fletcher would have provided a really good basis for understanding climate justice principles and its relevance in how we report on climate change in Caribbean small islands. And I will, consider this climate justice framing, but I'll also be looking at three key issues. One, defining a justice framing for the Caribbean. Two, creating a Caribbean-led evidence base for justice and equity. And three, identifying story angles from the evidence and research for climate reporting. And, I'd like to start this, presentation with an understanding of justice, not through climate change, but actually through Caribbean literature, right? And it's basically the hypothesis is that in the Caribbean, our frame of reference has been from a justice and resistance sort of framing. And now we're talking about climate change, but how can we use what it is we already know to start reporting and improve on how we report on climate change from that? So, everybody knows this poem, I would say. It's actually one of my favorite poems. It honestly, and I will, I'll reveal my age here. So Martin Carter had passed away in December of 1997. And this was the year that I was in Form 4. And this was one of the poems that we actually had to do. I fell in love with this poem. It's such a simple, powerful poem. And it's, simple language, just 3 stanzas, and it really speaks to, it records the natural beauty of right here in the Caribbean, but also the oppression that we are very much aware of and experience and know well in the region. And, the poem is, a record of the lived reality of Ghana pre-independence. And it was written after, Martin Carter was arrested for his political activities. And really and truly what you see is this poem is about resistance, but it still maintains empathy and dignity in the face of a destructive, oppressive force. And in so doing, it really continues to build solidarity and validates resistance. 70 years, over 70 years since it was first published, and still inspiring, I would say, young Caribbean people today. And, this is Derek Walcott's Nobel Laureate lecture from 1992. And a little personal story. I actually saw a video of this lecture in 1992, the Christmas holidays when I was 9 years old. So again, revealing my age. And it's because, you know, my mom is a retired English teacher, dean of English, and she had actually borrowed this video from the school library, and she was quite excited to view this, and she told me and my sister and so on, we have to sit down and watch this. And we had to borrow a VCR from one of the neighbors, because we didn't actually have a VCR at the time. And, you know, I started watching this, and Walcott opened this lecture, his speech, by describing, you know, the performance of Ram Leela happening in Felicity, which is a village that's not actually far away from where I grew up, and I grew up in Couva. And when he was speaking about the Ram Leela, you know, community theater in action that's taken place in villages throughout Trinidad, even today, you know, I could relate to this because, you know, my parents would take me to watch Ram Leela, you know, every year, and I still do it today. And it was very powerful for me because this is me, my lived experience being represented on a global stage, right? And people were enthralled at Derek Walcott's, you know, lecture and discussing Ram Leela, things that I knew very intimately and aware of. And, you know, at the time, I didn't really understand the main themes and so on, but as I got older, one of the key themes that emerged from this lecture is really about history versus memory. And Walcott really argued that, and he was quite critical of the prevailing, you know, Eurocentric view that history should be recorded, linear, historical records, you know, spanning millennia. And, you know, the prevailing view that in the Caribbean, we don't actually have any real history because we don't have any long trail of written historical records. And, you know, he actually asserts that we do, but our history is not linear, it's not written, but instead it's more efforts of memory. And it's poetic, it's dynamic, and it's fluid, but it is still very much valid. And it was created and sustained due to, you know, as a means for our survival and resistance, right? And that's actually quite important because, you know, for example, our storytelling art forms like Ram Leela, like Calypso, and also our traditional mass, these are our cultural and living records and our collective memory and histories that we have to still celebrate and utilize. So I think what this lecture really showcased is that, you know, one, Derek Walcott really provided a space for Caribbean, you know, lived experiences and narratives on a world stage, but then he was also challenging who are the prevailing voices that should be heard, whose knowledge is legitimate, and also understanding what should be valued and by who, right? So these justice connotations coming up here. And, you know, these selected works of these two Caribbean literary stalwarts, they have nothing to do with climate change, but they have everything to do with justice, I would say. And they really enshrine these sorts of justice principles that we are well aware of. And I would like to you know, posit that, you know, climate justice in the Caribbean and how we think about climate justice in the Caribbean is really looking at these various principles that I've outlined here that Jimmy, that Colin, that Rana have touched upon in their different presentations today. And in the Caribbean, climate justice is really about building solidarity and enabling transformational change such that deeply entrenched historical and structural inequities and injustices are no longer propagated. And the climate justice principles that I've outlined here really guide the work of the Climate Analytics Caribbean Office, particularly the work that we do on adaptation, loss and damage, just transition, and so forth. And in terms of, you know,
supporting this Caribbean-led evidence base for justice and equity. I mean, one of the first things I'd like to showcase and highlight is our climate analytics website. It's a fantastic repository of research and data on climate change issues, not only from, you know, the people at the Caribbean office, but throughout our offices around the world. And for example, under the publications tab, you'll find reports, policy briefs, peer-reviewed articles. Under the news and events tab, you'll find blog posts written by CA experts, including from us in the Caribbean office on a range of issues. The most recent blog post is on 1.5 overshoot. But it also looks at, you know, press releases, media coverage, and so on. And I would say that the CA resource should be one of your resource tools to look at. And it could be the first step in developing your climate story, right? It is very much focused on evidence and data. And, you know, when you're looking at, let's say, these technical reports and policy briefs and so on from here, my suggestion would really be to look at the executive summary and the recommendation sections in order to find possible story angles. And this is coming from somebody who actually does not like to read technical work, and working in a policy division in the ministry, you have to learn to have a really snappy and to the point and concise executive summary, because that is probably what the minister will read only. So that's what I think what we try to do, to make sure that the executive summary really captures the essence and the recommendations coming out from it. And now I'd like to really focus on a few of the CA Caribbean reports and research with a focus on loss and damage. And that's because I lead the adaptation on loss and damage research program in the Caribbean office. And this report, a review of loss and damage in the Caribbean 1994 to 2024, it's a landmark report that provides a comprehensive assessment of loss and damage in the region over the past 30 years. And it's a landmark report because this was never done before. And it was co-authored by an all-female, multidisciplinary CA team based across the world. And some of the research questions included, how has loss and damage been framed in the region? And what are the projected costs of future loss and damage for the region? And it's quite interesting to note that last November, there was a COP30 decision that established a process to deliver an annual state of loss and damage report. And I'd like to posit that this CA report actually supported developing the position or enhancing the position of the Alliance of Small Island States, who did advocate for the establishment of having an annual state of loss and damage report under the UNFCCC regime. So you could see, you know, the links. It's a causal link, it's not direct, but I would like to say that there is some, you could see this happening and how evidence could influence decisions at the global level, as well as from local all the way up. I won't read this. You all could read that though. But I really wanted to look at what are some potential story angles just based from this report. And, you know, one important story is really defining key climate change terms. And we've been hearing a lot about this already, and you're probably oversaturated with this by now. You know, what is loss and damage? What is non-economic loss and damage versus economic loss and damage? And start contextualizing them through examples of loss and damage impacts, but also contextualizing them through the climate injustices faced by local communities, by vulnerable groups, and so on. So now you're building out a narrative, right? And now you're getting perspectives and views and experiences from people who might not be well represented. They may not have a voice to say these things, right? So now it becomes a platform to share this, and this becomes part of the knowledge base. And then also, another potential story angle would be build upon the research questions of this report. So, for example, one of the research questions were, what are the projected future costs of loss and damage in the Caribbean? And we have an entire section of the report on this, but also start interpreting the findings through a climate justice framing, right? So looking at is the projected future costs, who benefits, right? Who has access? How is this money being used? So now you're now expanding on the reporting to fit a more justice lens. And this report, Loss and Damage Financing and Debt Sustainability, Advancing Justice and Equity in the Caribbean, is actually our newest report, and it was co-authored by Dr. Priya Mohan at UE Solicitors in St. Augustine and myself. And it was launched last year, but I would say if you want story angles and stories, read this report, basically. And no, I'm very serious. I'm really serious about this. So what this report really focuses on, and Dr. Fletcher spoke about this, about the climate debt trap. And small islands, like right here in the Caribbean, we face escalating loss and damage impacts due to climate change. We've spoken about the hurricanes, flooding, droughts, and so on, and examples previously. And Dr. Fletcher, mentioned that a single event could actually wipe out decades of hard-won development gains. And, losses from Hurricane Maria that happened in 2017 was estimated at 226% of GDP for that country alone, right? And similarly, in Grenada in 2004, when Hurricane Ivan had hit, that had decimated Grenada, and Grenada took about 20 years to fully recover, and then it was hit by Hurricane Beryl. Carriacou was especially hit, and now that cycle has to repeat again. So what we're seeing is that, loss and damage really forces countries to undertake massive borrowing for reconstruction and recovery, which starts to push their already high debt to GDP ratios into crisis. And small islands who bear who have minimal greenhouse gas emissions really and truly bear the brunt of this loss and damage, leading to climate-induced debt distress that hinders development, the so-called climate debt trap. Because when you start borrowing, right, the first thing you have to do is repay that debt, even before you start thinking about other things. So now you have to start prioritizing, do I pay the debt, or do I focus on improving my healthcare? Do I pay the debt, or do I focus on education, right? And anybody would know that the first thing that comes out of your salary is your loan payment. No, it is true, and that is the first thing that any sort of debt management office in the Ministry of Finance, that is what they have to do. Finance that debt first, and then deal with everything else after, right? Which is something that we take for granted, but what does this debt to GDP ratio actually mean? And what does this climate debt trap mean for the Caribbean countries, and what are the practical realities of that? And those are some questions and reporting angles to consider. That's why I had told you all that this report has a lot of story angles. And, one of the things this report focused on was looking at what are the innovative loss and damage financing mechanisms that are already being used around the world. And as Dr. Fletcher mentioned, we've actually pioneered a lot of innovative financing mechanisms like parametric insurance, like the CRIF. It's a country risk pool parametric insurance facility. We also have, debt for climate swaps, debt for debt pause clauses, and so forth. Right? So, and then also, the report also considers, looking at traditional and indigenous finance mechanisms. So, we considered the importance of traditional and indigenous finance for supporting community resilience against climate shocks. This could be like the Susu or the Boxand, and supporting cooperatives and credit unions in order to provide financially inclusive and accessible financial products to support climate resilience, particularly in underserved communities and groups, which include the unbanked, right? Because financial inclusion and building climate resilience cannot be hinged on whether I have a bank account or not, right? And in terms of what should loss and damage financing consider, what are the justice and equity considerations that should be incorporated into the design and rollout of these financing mechanisms, we also consider that in the report. And what we outlined was practical actions and low-hanging fruit to enable justice, accountability, and fairness in access to and the use of loss and damage finance funds. And some considerations include removal of financial barriers, such as the need for a bank account, land tenure, farmers' badges for grant assistance from disaster relief, for example. So there's an example from Barbados. In 2024, when Hurricane Beryl had hit and had really impacted the fishing industry there, the government did provide grant assistance, but it was mainly for people who had boats, so boat owners. But in the fishing industry, a lot of people don't actually own boats, so they weren't able to access that that sort of assistance. Then also the sort of requirements that were required, people needed to have a bank account, and people also needed to show that they had a tax identification number, a TIN. But fishermen and farmers and so on, they're part of the informal sector, so they may not have a bank account. So, don't exclude people who are the most vulnerable from being able to access relief and recovery to deal with climate impacts, right? So it's looking at these angles that might not be, looking at these angles and bringing that out into how we report on climate change and on loss and damage finance, on loss and damage response. And some potential, story angles would be, for example, really unpacking the different loss and damage financing mechanisms. So, for example, how does parametric insurance work? How does the CRIF work? Looking at catastrophe bonds that Dr. Fletcher mentioned for Jamaica. So how they work, evaluate how they encompass climate justice principles through case studies. And he spoke about the cat bond being triggered, 100% payout last year when Hurricane Melissa hit. And that was because the specific trigger that actually set off that cat bond was met. And it was the barometric pressure of the eye of the storm had to be under a particular level. So it had to be under, I think it's 902 decibels. Or something of barometric pressure, right? So they got the full payout last year, which is fantastic. But a year before, in 2024, when Jamaica was hit by I think it was by Hurricane Beryl, that trigger was not activated. So they did not. So the cat bond had no payouts, right? But instead, the investors who invested into the cat bond, they got, they were paid, right? So now it's looking at justice and is it right, is it just and fair for any sort of loss and damage financing instrument to I would say, award investors for a country's suffering, right? And it's not, it has nothing to do with whether it works or it doesn't work, but now it's just bringing a different angle and trying to understand these sorts of financing mechanisms and the implications of them. And then another story angle would be, showcasing our indigenous financing mechanisms, looking at the SUSU and assessing what are the challenges and opportunities in supporting financial resilience from climate shocks to highly vulnerable, unbanked communities and groups through highlighting examples and stories, right? And yep, I think that is it. Any questions for me? I hope it really helped you start thinking about how to use the climate justice as a framing when you start looking and reviewing the research and reports and evidence to start pulling out, story angles on when you do your reporting. So thank you.
Your comments? I'm not seeing anybody online with any questions or comments. Anybody in the room? So, Gerard?
Thanks, Sasha. I think it was really courageous to take that angle up top with the Caribbean literature. Very inspiring. Very thought-provoking how, in a sense, our Caribbean, that cultural heritage of resistance and survival and resilience, it's kind of baked into the heritage, right? Or the cultural cues there that already exist. I guess it's a comment, not a question.
No. Yeah, so it was basically, I was asked to speak, and, because I give such technical presentations, and I mean, my mother was an English teacher, so I was surrounded, and my aunt was the head librarian for the Carnegie Free Library, for the children's section, so I was surrounded by books and literature all my life. So I just wanted to be able to have an opportunity to connect literature with the work that I do on climate policy and so on. So thank you.
Yeah, I've never seen someone connect literature and climate change before, but you did it successfully. Sasha, I do want to ask though, because we have reporters in your room of different levels. Some are young reporters, some are fairly seasoned reporters, but all in common, we've not probably studied a degree in climate change or anything like that. What is your advice in recommending that we read such reports like you and Dr. Mohan had presented last year? What is your advice for us in how do we really deconstruct such large volumes of information into potential stories?
No, but that's a very good question. And I know a lot of the, the reports and so on coming on climate change, it's very technical. There's a lot of data. So it's really trying to, how do you interpret this data? And how to make this relevant to the audience, right? And I think what you have to ask is what is the story or what it is you want to report on, right? Is it the data? Is it the analysis? Is it the findings? But then if it's the findings of, for example, the last 3 years have been the hottest on record, year after year, are you just going to report that and what the WMO stated, or are you going to look at connecting that with, I would say heat waves or droughts and so on in the region or in Trinidad and Tobago, and actually start highlighting how have farmers, rural communities, school children and so on been impacted by this. So connecting the sort of evidence happening at the global level to something that is more contextual, that people could understand here. So that's one example. Also, I would say start looking critically at the evidence and seeing how it could be applicable to whatever beat that you focus on, if it's on, crime, if it's on sports, if it's on, business and economy, right? And then you will start being able to now, instead of treating climate change as this feature, it's now more mainstream into how we report on these issues.
Thank you for the information. So I'm interested in the story on the innovative financing instruments, because you told of two accounts, and you gave different sides of two of them. Like, I knew about the payout to the fishermen. I did not know the issue that some of them had with not having tax information. I knew that the bond in Jamaica was not triggered when Hurricane Beryl struck, but I did not know they also had to pay the investors. So, because I'm interested in that story, do you have like at least two other similar incidents or instruments that where something similar happened, where you had, yes, a beneficial financial instrument to deal with climate impacts, but at the same time, there was the downside? Could you help me with that, please?
Sure. So, stories and looking at debt for climate swaps. And we have examples, in Belize has their debt for climate swap. Barbados have, I think it's a blue bond that they've implemented. But these are quite new, but you could look at other countries, for example, Seychelles and their debt for nature swap, which they focus on coral reef resilience. But yeah. Yeah, so I think if you expand to the Seychelles, what they saw is that, the benefit from the debt for nature swap was not actually accrued, or it did not actually reach the beneficiaries, which would have been the communities and the fishermen and so on. So it's trying to understand why. And those are the sorts of justice and equity considerations to look at when you're doing these sorts of reporting on these financial mechanisms, or else it'll be very technical and people cannot relate to this.
Okay, there being nothing more. Okay. Thank you very much, Sasha.
Thank you.
Excellent. Sasha probably noticed I was grinning from ear to ear during that presentation, because this is indeed the dark time, my love. It is a season of oppression, dark metal, and tears. How better can you describe the news agenda of 2026 globally and here in Trinidad and Tobago? Thank you very much. I actually met Martin Carter more than once in person, and I also met Derek Walcott. And if I want to talk about the love that reassembles the broken fragments of the vase, we are also telling the story of Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. If you want to talk about reparatory justice, then think about the love that reassembles the broken vase being greater than the symmetry we took for granted when it was whole. So thank you very much for that. I don't need to say anything else. That is just sort of perfect. And I think it's a way of looking at the problems of today that's very, very important, because we are going into a period basically of transactional development and politics. So let me see what we could get. Let me see what we have. Give me that. Take that. And it's essentially a political question. The story of the climate crisis is a political story, because it does have everything to do with power dynamics, how power is distributed within our communities, within our countries, within the region, and where we are within the world. Because if we look at how things are unfolding in terms of the global response to the situation we confront today, because of things that are not our doing. But at the same time, there's a way of expressing that that takes us off the platform for responsibility when we do not at the same time look at to what extent do the measures that we are taking to address it do not themselves create problems. So the climate justice question is not only a justice question between nations, but it's between communities and sectors in our countries and in our region. Now, I thought I would open with this slide. I last looked at this like 2 years ago. I think Dr. Fletcher might remember this slide, which looks at world newspaper coverage of climate change. And I'm pointing to it because it does provide an indication of what is happening and the peaks and troughs of explicit climate change coverage. This is coverage, and the researchers here, they basically did word searches looking for where there's mention of climate change or global warming. Climate change being my preferred reference because, you know, there are very powerful politicians who are sometimes saying, "Boy, the place is getting warm. How come it have snow outside?" Right? And we know where that is going. That's part of that whole situation. That's feeding into the power dynamic in terms of our situation here in the Caribbean and in other small island states and low-lying coastal areas. Let's not forget them because they're part of the story as well. So this world newspaper coverage of climate change or global warming is flawed from that perspective in that there's a focus on newspaper coverage of climate change, global warming. And you notice that where there are peaks, 2010, COP16 was it? I can't remember which COP that was, 2010, and then 2023. I think Dr. Fletcher spoke about that. I have but no doubt I didn't bring up with me, but those essentially are COP years. And you'll find that there's this huge concentration on climate change in media here. The other observation about this chart, and I had written these people back whenever it was, saying, hey, they have Central Latin America, and you look at the newspapers that they were examining, and none of it came from the Caribbean. So, hey, that's something of an inequity there in terms of the focus and what they were actually looking at. So I'm opening with that because just to make the broader point in our context, which is that explicit climate change coverage tends to be episodic. So something happens or something is happening, and we start writing those climate change stories. So we had COP30, and so the newspaper pages and the news broadcasts were heavily populated with very explicit climate change stories. But I always contend that we already cover climate change. And if you listen to Carlin's presentation, it was very instructive because it's there. The climate impacts are there. The the activities to address it are there as well, but they don't necessarily always earn a banner headline of climate change or the climate crisis. Now, you know that some newspapers globally have included as part of their style guides the use of climate crisis whenever reference to climate change is regularly mentioned. And as a result, when we revised our handbook back in 23, I think it was, we said covering the climate crisis, because for us, it represents a crisis. And it's not the kind of crisis, as I mentioned in a newspaper column this morning. I sent a link, I hope people read it. This is more than just saying, we go dead over a microphone in a crowded carnival fete. It is more than that. It is different. This is a different thing. We are not running around the place saying, we go dead, we go dead. Or, look at how they have we. It is a far more nuanced examination of something that's happening, that's unfolding. And Sasha's presentation captured that quite well, because what we are seeing is that in virtually every space where people occupy here in the Caribbean, elsewhere, there are people in sub-Saharan Africa, they will give you a different, they're hardly small island states or low-lying coastal regions, but they are experiencing impacts that were never experienced before, or impacts that have experienced before in far more extreme measures. So what is our context? And I think that the context is always very important. What is the Caribbean context really? Limited natural resources. Now what does that have to do with this? Well, limited natural resources would point in the direction of our ability to recover from more extreme climate events, weather events, and other things. It's a much larger story, and a lot of it was captured in the presentation so far. I'm not going to get into the technical details, but it's something that we need to build into our consciousness, that part of the problem, or one of the reasons why addressing the crisis has not basically kept up with the needs or the demands, is that we are in an area where there are limited natural resources. And they're changing resource bases and development focus. I've lived and worked in Guyana. I could tell you Guyana in the 1990s and Guyana now, two different places altogether. And it has to do with the changing resource bases, where they're deriving their national revenue from, and changes in the development focus. It happened to us. I'm old enough to remember the 1970s and the oil boom in 1973. Okay, yes, I was in school at the time, I'm not 100 years old. But it came at a time of social upheaval here in Trinidad and Tobago. We were coming off of 1970 and the Black Power movement, equity, reparatory justice, you want to say, whatever, but we came from a situation in which inequities were being addressed in different kinds of ways, and the development focus was being designed in such a way as to address those challenges. Another thing you would notice that throughout the Caribbean, in those areas where you have populations, the capital centers, etc., we have generally high population densities. And you know, Dr. Sasha and others can probably give you country by country the kind of problematic issues in terms of the supply of water, the allocation of how development is planned and so on, and the relationship between that and what is happening to us in terms of the climate conditions. High susceptibility to natural hazards, and we don't need to go too much of that. I was mentioning how I went into to Grenada like 2 days after Ivan, and you will not understand what a hurricane does to a small country like Grenada if you did not see that, or if you did not witness Dominica, if you did not witness Bahamas. I didn't see it in any of the slides, but there are islands that were depopulated possibly forever. That means you had societies, you had communities, you had community leaders, you had activity, you had children growing up, you had people who think that you have hope. What I will be when I get big, you know? And disappeared, gone, it's 0, 0, 0, 0. And these are the kinds of context we need to bring to this story. I'm not going to mention Dominica because I have PTSD, okay? I was speaking about it the other day when we talk about mental health and journalists, and I don't survive it. So with high susceptibility to natural hazards, low economic resilience, the ability to bounce back. So you put these things, and that's the context. That's the context. There's more. Poor infrastructure in vulnerable areas. Now, we did a story at MIC on building back better, and that was in relation to Dominica. Because it is one thing to recover, to say you have recovered, but how? Post-Melissa in Jamaica, St. James, St. Elizabeth, the Black River area and so on, yes, people are coming back together. One of our colleagues, Natalie Ligo, is in Jamaica right now, and her family house, family residence is in St. Elizabeth, and even though the electricity company is posting a 99% return of electricity, what about those buildings where you can't, the grid is there, electricity flowing there, but it can't come to your house because the post gone, your roof gone, you still have to pay to rewire, la. So poor infrastructure in vulnerable areas. St. Elizabeth, the most wooden structures in Jamaica are concentrated in that parish. And that's exactly where Melissa aimed. And so poor infrastructure in vulnerable. Let's snap out of this dream that something will happen, okay? Underdeveloped support systems, insurance and financial sectors. I remember post-Ivan, I was doing a story for IPS. Jewel, you shrink for IPS still. And I was looking at this precise question of insurance. So what happened to people insurance, whatever? And then I just gave the example of the Montego Bay Chamber of Commerce. And if you go up and down the island chain, you will see that insurance is not a natural part of business for a lot of people, you know. Perhaps the majority, and especially since we have a situation in which the small and micro enterprise sector is growing. Post-COVID, it grew, and it continues to grow, but you also have rising informality. So Carlin's point that the ILO has been picking up some of these issues, which are basically social justice issues, resonates when it comes to these kinds of questions. The insurance, and I remember doing the story for IPS, and I called the Insurance Association here in Trinidad and Tobago, and I said, well, you know, I know a little bit about this. I spent some time in the insurance industry early in my life. Reinsurance, how are the reinsurers looking at it? Because if you understand how this thing works, if the reinsurers lose interest in you, you're dead, because there are no insurance company really strong enough to manage the losses at these times. An insurance company, the Insurance Association of Trinidad and Tobago, I wrote it in the story, I could say it here, had no idea what the hell I was talking about. They had no idea. So if they don't get with the program, if our business reporters don't cover that story, then people won't understand the reality. And there is a growing number of businesses that are being established without insurance cover. One, because the premiums are very high and rising. And two, because it's not for part of their business model. When they come in together and say, hey, I'm learning how to build bird houses, whatever. I don't like bird houses. Anyhow, whatever, something like that. Let me do that. So how much will cost? So much of the wood, so much of the wire, whatever. Insurance premiums don't enter that picture at all. That's not part of the business model. Geopolitical entanglements, and I did that. This was in my presentation back in 2012, whatever it was. Is our interface on the question of the climate crisis one such that it is being led through the geopolitics by narratives in the bigger, better developed countries? Well, what are you worrying about, man? That ain't real. So we saw it. Everybody here probably followed the UN General Assembly and the contribution, and one particular country contribution where nationally determined contributions was categorized as a needless bother that was being bullied. That was a part of the bullying of smaller countries like ours. So that's part of the story. If you look at the quote-unquote geopolitical entanglements, that's a climate crisis story, because it resonates in terms of our response to this growing crisis. Changing economic circumstances, foreign direct investment in the energy sector, and so on. We got into that. I did have Petrotrin in mind, Carlin. And yes, it is a political question. It is a supremely political question, because it is not simply a matter of closing a facility or one facility or something being here today and not there tomorrow, and that is the end of that. It's a whole broader picture covered by our media here, but not contextualized against the backdrop of resilience, economic resilience, and what we need in terms of taking us forward as a country. I have geopolitical entanglements there because I was reviewing this, and it stuck in my brain because of current events so much that I had to put it twice. It sounded so nice, I put it twice, but it's not really something nice. And then regional integration. The integration movement is designed or has as a core function our ability to jointly address something like the climate crisis. Without it, we're just fooling ourselves, you know. We're just fooling ourselves. We can't discuss the climate crisis without covering or discussing how we as small island states and low-lying coastal areas, so the benefit of my Belizean, Surinamese, and Guyanese friends, without mentioning the fact that none of us can go this alone. None of us. And we would be fooling ourselves to believe that there are others who will turn up and to the rescue. Maybe if we're short on paper towels, we will be assisted. But outside of that, nowhere to go. So in the integration movement, and if you follow my column, my blog, you'll see I talk about this all the time. We ain't going nowhere. Okay? And societies and civilizations far greater than ours have come and disappeared. Okay? Gerard knows what I'm talking about. If you've been to Athens, remember Greek Empire, Roman Empire, right? Far greater in every aspect than what we have today, come and gone. So who are we? Okay. So what are the takeaways from this particular thing? And I know I'm up in the air a bit, but I can afford to be glad because between Sasha and Carlon, I think they've given us the story angle, the specific story angles to all of this. High vulnerability to socio-economic impacts. If there's an economic impact, there's a socio-cultural impact. Because who is affected? Everybody is not affected the same way. The coastal communities, people up on the northern range, eastern coastal areas, sea level rise, and it's real, and the data exists. If you wanted to, I remember there was Petrotrin once did a risk analysis of the Gulf of Paria area. Yes, it's still the Gulf of Paria. And they looked at what would happen if given different scenarios in terms of sea level rise in that area, including issues such as saline intrusion into areas that might be agricultural as well. Systemic inequity. We could go back to Sasha again, you know, and to Carlon, because where we came from did not really start everybody off on an equal footing, right? So we have to accept that. We have to put that in our pipe and smoke it, draw on it heavily, because that is a fact of life. During the COVID lockdown, one of the things, admonitions I was extending to colleagues in the media was, watch your privilege. We were receiving curfew passes. That don't mean that was the case for everybody. We had access to the officials and the politicians at the press conferences. Those are privileges. We claim it as rights because as journalists we can assert a right to have that information to be able to transmit it to our audiences. But we had to be careful about our quote-unquote privilege. And we have problematic policy transitions throughout the region. How is Guyana managing its transition? And that's another key word to bear in mind, because there's a way, and I think it was Sasha mentioned, Dr. Fletcher, the notion of just transition. It's transitioning because we have systemic inequity. at the global level, at the regional level, and at the country and community levels, where everybody don't have equal access to everything. So it's, anytime there's a decision for us to move from one phase of development to the next, it's almost guaranteed to be uneven and unequal. Likewise, with the just transition from where we are today to a low carbon reality, it's not going to happen to everybody in exactly the same way. Now, I think that we already do cover these kinds of issues. We probably don't target as climate change or climate crisis or anything, but we are, throughout the region, experiencing these economic transitions where we are moving from one sector, emphasis on one sector to the next, and these things are not having equal impacts. And we need to capture that because that's where the stories are. If there's a loss of economic opportunity because of sea level rise or because of warming ocean temperatures and the fishermen are not catching, they're not getting the catches that they used to get before, and the younger people, well, that is not really in my future. I'm going to look for a work in Port of Spain or San Fernando or Kingston or Kingstown or wherever. Then you have the disappearance of economic opportunity. You have the erosion that would take place with respect to the socio-cultural makeup of these different societies and communities. And we need to report on that. We need to keep an eye on that because the question of just transition is not only a question of low carbon, of where we are, carbon emissions to low carbon, but it's also a transition from one state of being to the next. Okay? It's some up there, but we see it in the newspapers all the time, but it is not nuanced or flagged in that kind of way. So when we cover in the crime stories, to what extent is the disappearance of economic opportunity because of circumstances related to more extreme climate, weather events, destruction of our hills? Because Trinidad and Tobago, we see the smoke everywhere, right? People burning, slash and burn agriculture. You mash up prospects for long-term development in those areas. Where do young people go in? What are they going to do? Where are they going to get their money from? Now, that, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that if you're poor, you commit poverty creates crime. But there's a link between the absence of economic opportunity and a rise in criminal behavior at that level, because we do have criminal behavior elsewhere. The development, now long time, I'm old enough again to talk, to know, I've known about the McBride Commission report. Look, Gerard knows everything. He could probably recite pages from it, of 1973 it was, I think it was, where they talk about the development role of media. I don't subscribe to an explicit developmental role. I think that if you have good journalism, there's going to be a developmental impact. And that developmental impact will come through audiences, average everyday people, asking more questions about the reality and applying political pressure, and I use political in its broadest sense here, to ensure that those circumstances change. So how is that framed? The reporting needs to create the awareness about the hazardous effects of poor environmental conditions. Now, not all of it is explicitly climate, because we have, throughout the region, I'll just pick one issue, waste management, both solid and liquid waste management. Highly problematic area. I remember I contributed to a document, a draft solid waste management policy with Trinidad and Tobago, the public communication aspect of it. Can't remember what year it was again, and old. But that is on a shelf somewhere, right? There are hazards associated with that, and it does not take a big jump to associate what's happening in terms of climate to those poor environmental conditions that are creating hazardous effects. We can also talk about the positive impacts of good environmental conditions. And there are all kinds of very tangible ways, right? Friends of mine, I've been boasting over the past few months about the fact that I have a CNG vehicle, right? And you know how that came about? I remember parking by a gas station, and I am there filling my tank at the previous car, and it, 200 and something dollars, TT. We have an online audience, okay? And the guy next to me, fill up, $12. Well, that is me these days. That is me. I said, next guy has to be a CNG vehicle. Okay? CNG, if you want to be scientific about it, the operative fuel is methane. Okay? Which is described as well as problematic in a sense, but if we wanted to, we could drill that down to the quantities. Okay? So is there a positive or a negative impact in terms of the low carbon environment? And a simple story, of CNG. I've seen CNG thing, and it's usually complaints about it. We don't have enough stations, which is true. But those are ways that we can break things down. That includes those things that contribute positively to the low carbon future that we're talking about. If you believe that the low carbon future is what is important and decisive, because not everybody does, My column today I talk about is a whole cocktail of disinformation associated to these things that we could talk about, but we'll waste time. And to inspire public support for corrective and preventative official measures. I think that in media, by highlighting the kinds of challenges people have in their communities, it's important, but it's not good. It's not good enough to stand alone. That what we need to do is to provide greater context. When people come to us, or we harness the public opinion, that we capture that sort of treatment of it. The stories, we have specific stories. Dr. Fletcher, all of the presenters before gave us specific stories for follow-up. One, the issue of climate change represents a crisis. There are some media houses, as I said, not here, where the preference is to describe what is happening as the climate crisis as opposed to climate change. In my own writing, I use climate crisis. What is mitigation? What is adaptation? And we discussed that. The technical folks are here if you want to get more details on the distinction. It's an important distinction because it relates back to the just transition issues and others. Who foots the bill? So if we have to make these changes, who's going to pay for all of this? Where's the money coming from? If we need compensation, where's it going to come from? The challenges of environmental management. I talk about waste management, but water. Ryan and I had a discussion on this at COP30. Water is a big story, And not only people coming to complain, I say, water. It is a big, very interesting story, worthy of more extensive discussion, media coverage. Again, because I sometimes wear these different hats, I was asked to moderate the discussion on water management policy in Trinidad and Tobago, again 1,000 years ago. And the scientists, the technical people have the information, they have the story. We didn't take them on, because we will take on the fellow who came to one consultation, and I had to be escorted by police to my car. He came holding his baby. And he said, water. This is my child. Ta-la-la-la-la. And he was, valid story, perfectly valid story, which needs to be framed in the context of water management and the fact that some traditional sources are disappearing because of unplanned development, because of all kinds of issues. It's not a matter of the water authority being evil, and then it depends on which constituency, water, whatever. The story bigger than that. If you could conceive of a story that's bigger than partisan politics, it's bigger than that. So water as a story. The environmental impacts of development projects, the approval systems, etc. Soil contamination, we were dealing with a story out of Antigua and Barbuda. I'm not sure if it's published yet, about food in the context of food security, which again, my preference is for nutrition security over food security, because I have a lot of food, belly full, but okay, what happened? You're riddled with non-communicables. So nutrition security, and the story is produced, and I said, what happened to the oil farming, the bunker oil farming that takes place when these cruise ships come in? What do we do with the bunker oil? Okay, so yes, tourism and things, plenty of people come in, right? But the ships that are bringing them, what happens to the waste oil, the bunker oil? And then you have, where does all of this fit now in terms of the global turmoil and instability we are experiencing? There's a very direct place for all that we discussed here today in terms of the global turmoil and instability. If you're prepared to drill it down to your specific country, and I know we have on the call people from Belize go down to Suriname, think about it, but think about it not only in terms of political conflict. Think about it in terms of resource allocation, the prospects for recovery in our countries that are under siege right now practically, the withdrawal of development support, which is systematic, conscientious, deliberate withdrawal of development support financing, and then you put that alongside the just transition and the whole matter of reparatory justice, of somebody having to pay or take up the thing, take responsibility for what is happening to us. Yes, there's a shared responsibility, but let us look at that now in terms of the global turmoil and instability and some of the things that are flowing out of that. Actually have about an hour more to talk about this thing, so not going to get through this. Equity issues covered by the others, women and girls. Okay, the UN system is very heavy on this, and at one time I say, well, what's this bothersome thing? It's a very real story. Urban versus rural, to the extent that we can make that distinction in a lot of our countries, because there are some islands that are basically rural community, big rural communities. Migrants, how are we attending to our migrant populations and all this, and other marginalized groups? If we wanted to, MIC spend some time looking at this in terms of the migrants, the disabled, and other people with very special needs, children. Inequitable distribution of the costs, we spoke about that. Imbalances in negotiation of measures. COP30 just finished, and Dr. Fletcher, Sasha were there, and they can tell you about it, could give you a full story about this thing, about imbalances in the negotiation and how that occurs, where they put where we are welcome and where we are not welcome. And those are the other issues. This presentation will be, I want to leave space for Ryan, who's going to come and talk to us about where we go from here, basically. So he's going to, but think about all these things. Cross-cutting, the episodic coverage is not coverage. That is, you're covering an event. Environmental activism, that in itself is not all. The scientific disagreements, what is being disagreed on or what is not being disagreed on. Human cause or anthropogenic causes are beyond debate, and I'm seeing people publishing in the public space questions about whether it's really human beings that are exacerbating an already natural thing. Political conflict, and then most of all, money. So That's it from me. Thanks a lot, folks. Brian?
Any questions, anyone? There is a comment here, Wesley. I think it's more of a comment than a question from Michelle Matthews Moranci. Right now we are talking about wider framing, but there are also lots of human angle stories about water and water shortages / management and other issues. How it impacts women disproportionately, as well as like period poverty, for instance, coupled with lack of access to clean water during natural disasters. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
Well, it's more comment, and I agree, yes. And I think that some of those things are covered, but as the questioner posed it, I mean, the context is very important. Who are the worst affected? How are they affected? And then getting to the bottom of it. So I'll leave it at that. I have a lot more to say on that.
Sure. Any questions from anybody? All right. So I will just pick up where Wesley would have left off. Thanks, Wesley. So last week, Friday, I had a conversation with Wesley when Bianca would have asked me to be here today. And, you know, I told him immediately, what am I doing there? You know, you have Wesley Gibbings. When I had started climate journalism, Wesley was one of my first instructors in a climate tracker class, and then Dr. James Fletcher is my mentor. You know, so what am I doing there? But he walked me off the ledge, and you know, I'm really happy to be here, and I feel so comfortable having some of my colleagues here as well. So, and I really like the mix that we have. I kind of danced around the room just before we started and tried to get to know some people, and we have some students from Costart here, which is so great to see, because when I studied at your school, we weren't in these rooms, you know, so, and then we have some seasoned journalists, so please interact with them, because this will go a long way in you know, harnessing their, and inspiring them to be climate reporters as well. So, I just really wanted to wrap everything together. We've heard a lot from Carla and from Sasha, from Dr. Fletcher and from Wesley this morning. I just wanted to all bring it together as we sort of end this morning. So I just briefly listed out much of what we would have heard this morning. And it sort of re-emphasizes what we already know, but what we often sort of don't think about. Climate change is not just a political topic. It's no longer just an environmental topic. And as Dr. Fletcher would have said, it's now really a legal issue as well. We were in Barbados in January when Canary hosted a climate justice forum. And it's a safe space, right? Yeah. And I remember Justice Winston Anderson, who's the Caribbean Court of Justice president. I remember him challenging those in the room, and I was shocked, and a lot of other people were shocked. Maya, you were there, I think, and we were shocked because he was saying it's time for our civil society actors in the region to challenge British Petroleum, BP and Shell and Exxon. Test the law, and you don't necessarily have to test the law at the CCJ. Test the law in Belgium. Test the law in Europe. So, as Dr. Fletcher was mentioning, the legal aspect of this, buoyed on by what Bianca was talking about, with the highest court in the world now ruling, the UN advisory opinion last year, you know, it's really injecting momentum into this climate fight. As reporters, climate change touches everything. And Kishan Kumar Singh also always likes to remind his students of this. It's not just environmental, it touches, he likes to give the example of crime, of how something that we would never even think about in terms of climate change, how it trickles down to actually making an impact on societal problems like crime. So it includes agriculture, the economy, tourism, and health. We'll come back to that in a minute. Climate change is also a justice issue, not just an environmental one, as we are coming to see more and more in this region. Vulnerable communities are being disproportionately affected. Reporting must center on equity, accountability, and lived experiences of people. And journalists are the ones that play a role in shaping those narratives and influencing those changes. Collaboration is also key. And that was a point that Carlin was making, that collaboration in the Caribbean as it pertains to climate justice. I want to take it a step further and say that those of us in the room who practice journalism, there is also a great need for us to also collaborate with our colleagues around the CARICOM region, and that's where the Media Institute of the Caribbean has done human service. Wesley, you might remember this story. So Natalie Legault and I, but also Esther Jones from Barbados. So Natalie was in Jamaica, Esther in Barbados, and I'm from here. And we worked on this story in 2024, right? Barbados' Forgotten Few, and looking at the health implications as it pertains to climate change and how it was affecting elderly in Barbados and the lack of policies, etc., that came with it. And this story, it was a Caribbean collaborative effort. Wesley oversaw it as our instructor. And this story actually won the Best Investigative Story at last year's CBU Awards. So there are opportunities for Caribbean collaboration to tell our stories. But more than that, you know, if nothing else, I really want everyone to walk out of this room understanding that you don't have to have an interest per se in agriculture or tourism to understand, or climate change alone to be a climate reporter. It touches everything. So last year, this was one of the stories that I would have done. One of the biggest climate stories last year was the Los Angeles wildfires, very early in the year. Now everything, obviously, we live in small societies, so you want to kind of connect it to the Caribbean. So what I did was I looked at how those Los Angeles, and what you found was companies like State Farm were pulling out of Los Angeles. And that's why I asked Dr. Fletcher the question, because in Los Angeles, people are no longer getting insurance for wildfires anymore. Those companies are like State Farm are pulling out. And so when I looked at it, at that same point in time, we were having flooding in Trinidad, particularly in places like Pinal. So and it crossed my mind, will we now see people in Pinal who want to insure their houses, you know, because they're so vulnerable to flooding, and people in Grenada who are vulnerable to flooding, will they be able to access it? So, you know, connecting the dots with that. We've been talking a lot about the energy transition this morning, but the reality is the renewables cost of the Caribbean. It's really, really expensive. So, you know, I'm showing you all of these things because we really ought to connect the dots with what is happening around us, and we are able to tell those stories. Right. So, in wrapping up, Sasha gave some really great story angles. Wesley gave some great story ideas as well. Even now, and we've gotten so much better at it since I started, but even now, I think climate reporters and environmental reporters always need a nudge and a reminder, because things are so highly technical and complex that we always forget the who, the human in it. And it's always great to have a gentle reminder that when we're covering any of these stories, who is most affected? Who are the people that we are talking about? Because if the numbers in the reports that Sasha and Priya are producing, if the numbers, right, are just that numbers, then we really are masking over, you know, really just overshadowing the human element of it. Highlighting local voices. This one is a little bit personal to me. How I could say this in a nice way. You cannot cover climate change from your newsroom. You can't do it in an air-conditioned, comfortable seat. Doesn't work that way. We need to get out into the communities. We need to go there. We need to meet with people who are being affected, like the fishermen, like the farmers, right? Whether it's drought or flooding or global warming or rising seas, whatever it is, and we need to talk to those people who are on the front lines. We also need to connect the climate impacts with the social, economic, and historic which becomes so much more important, that Wesley writes in The Guardian very often about the historical, not just CARICOM, but also he writes on the historical elements of climate change as well. Those things are very, very helpful. As much as possible, and this is difficult, particularly for those in Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and Suriname, but as much as possible, avoiding those extractive storytelling helps, and instead focusing on dignified storytelling. But like I said, that's very challenging because you live and operate in a oil and gas-based economy. So the challenge for us is, how do we, as we leave here this morning, how do we integrate a climate justice angle into at least one upcoming story that we're doing? And Wesley gave a few story ideas. I mean, one potential, this is something that I'm working on for this weekend, but everybody else is free to copy it. This Sunday is World Water Day, right? March 22nd, right? Our world faces enormous crises with water. In fact, the UN released a report in January saying that by 2050, half the world will actually be struggling for potable water. So real, genuine stories, as Wesley was mentioning. Build relationships with the community sources that you have. Use the data that people like Sasha and Priya and Climate Analytics provide, and challenge the dominant narratives, because in societies like ours, and I'll end on this, if you follow environmental reporting from the UK Guardian, from PBS Frontline, you would really be inspired and feel hopeful, right? But it's challenging in our society because when we work in small media houses and BP comes at you with a pre-action protocol letter, that's enough for your editor to say, well, push that aside because, you know, we don't want to take a chance on that because BP has such deep pockets that they could take that all the way to the Privy Council or the CCJ if you're in St. Lucia, right? But we really ought to challenge the dominant narratives. So I'll leave it there for now. A lot has been said this morning, not just on my presentation, but if you have any questions for Dr. Fletcher, who is the CARICOM Climate Envoy, who is here, Wesley, who is here, Colin is sitting at the back, Sasha there, you know, we'd welcome any feedback, comments, or questions that you have for any of us. Thank you all very much.
There are no questions or comments from the online participants. Anything here as we wrap? And don't run away immediately because we want to do a group shot as soon as I'm finished here. Okay, Paula.
Good afternoon, Paula Lindo, freelance journalist. My question is, I'll say it's relevant to me anyway. I wanted to find out for the journalists in the room and for the presenters and the organizer of the conference, you know, how do you feel about the integration of AI into reporting and the contribution of AI infrastructure to climate change, especially as Dr. Fletcher was saying about ecosystem destruction, given that data centers are traditionally placed in marginalized and polluted communities, and they use a lot of water, they use a lot of electricity. And I mean, some of the presentations had lots of AI posters and stuff. You know, what are your views on this?
Okay, so I think what I like about Paula's comment is that it presents an opportunity for reporting. Because I think the way AI is used in the Caribbean and treated, there is a space for reporting, basic education, and also exploring its implications on marginalized communities, its environmental impacts, because my understanding is that a lot of people are not aware of those things. So, and it makes a lot of sense in this discussion because there's a lot of environmental stories that we are being encouraged to explore. because there are things that are happening in the region that we're completely unaware of and need to be mainstreamed, and certain connections and contacts need to be made. So it's very much a question that justifies this workshop and the role of journalists in spreading relevant, accurate information and combating disinformation and misinformation on this particular topic. Because I think, especially and because AI is changing so quickly, the reporting has not met up with current reality.
Thank you for that question, and Suyuni, very well said. And Paula, yeah, this is something that we are struggling with. As Suyuni said, AI is continuously evolving, and we do see the need for the balance. We see that there are benefits, and of course, it's also a huge detriment to the environment. It's a huge drain on especially water resources. So Climate Analytics is actually developing an organizational-wide policy with regard to AI. We're looking at how it can be used responsibly, or if at all. We do have leaders within our organization who are very much against, very much against the use of AI completely. So I will say it's an evolving discussion, but our position, personally for Climate Analytics, is that we would prefer not to use it, but at the same time, we are looking into the benefits and the risk analysis, and completely empathize with your point of the drain on the environmental resources and kind of we don't want to be hypocrites, in this space. We need to practice what we preach. So thank you very much for your question. It's a very salient point, and we do need to discuss it further.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I don't know that we can stop it at the rate at which it is going and the way in which it is being adopted. So I think what we have to look at is responsible use of it. I can tell you AI is extremely useful for forecasting and modeling. A lot of the modeling that we're doing right now would not be possible without the use of that type of technology when we talk about even things like attribution science and what is likely to happen in the future. Those are tools that are extremely important to us. I'm not talking about me as a climate envoy, but in the technical space to look at the impacts, the likely impacts of climate change, and to do some of these desktop models as inadequate as I believe they are, because as I said, I think we are grossly underestimating the impacts of climate change. But the type of computing that is necessary to make that happen is beyond our capacity to do in a manual way. So I think what we have to do is try to see how we can have responsible use of AI. I keep saying, if we make the transition away from the use of fossil fuels, AI's use of energy is not a big deal, because AI's use of energy will be using renewable energy, not using fossil fuel derived energy. So again, I think it's something that is compelling us right now. And my other hat is an RE hat. Right now, renewable energy is at a price point where it is competing very favorably with fossil fuel energy. Solar energy plus battery energy storage systems is competing very well with the best cost fossil fuel, which is natural gas. And in a few years' time, it will surpass it. So really, there's nothing that is stopping us except vested interest in the fossil fuel industry from moving completely away from fossil fuels. I made a point in one of my Facebook op-eds that it's a little unfortunate and a bit ironic that what is happening in Cuba right now and the fact that there is probably going to be a collapse of the regime is caused by Cuba being strangled because of its dependence on fossil fuels, when the Cuban regime has thrived for over 50 years in making use of what is its own and not depending on anything foreign. And what is its own is renewable energy. It's wind, it's solar energy, but because it thought it would always have a regular supply of cheap fossil fuel from Venezuela, it did not accelerate its transition away from fossil fuels. And I think there's a lesson there for all of us. So that's a long-winded way of saying responsible AI and make the transition away from fossil fuels so that we are not guilty when I can drive my vehicle all over St. Lucia. You know why? Because I have solar panels on my roof that are powering my electric vehicle. So my carbon footprint is zero. I think, and that is what we have to do. We have to ensure that we do a lot more of. The use of water is something that we have to look at, because my country is in the process, the hotel industry in my country is in the process of barging water from Dominica right now. That's how serious the situation is. So yes, responsible AI. But I don't think we can stop it. I think it's at a point now where to say you're going to stop the use of AI is you're fighting against a juggernaut that...
Fantastic. I was itching to say something, but I'm not going to say it because you covered it. There's no turning back, Paula. There is no turning back. When TV came, people were concerned about radio. And I'm giving a media context here because we are doing a media summit. We're trying to raise the funding now on AI and media in the Caribbean. And it's going to be hosted in Trinidad and Tobago if it comes off. And so that is going to be part of the discussion. Responsible and ethical use of AI, and also what are the prospects for AI in terms of production of media content. So it's going to come in through that way. Jimmy.
As we're on that subject, and the subject of technology, there's something I didn't discuss and none of us discussed, and that's the whole question of geoengineering. That is increasingly becoming a topic in climate spaces, and I think it's something that you need to start being aware of. What is being proposed is that, okay, you know what? The only way we can get back to 1.5 and be able to reduce the impacts of carbon dioxide and these other greenhouse gases on our environment is to use technology to take them out. So we're not talking about geoengineering, carbon capture, and there are all sorts of ethical arguments that are associated with that. So technology is a double-edged sword, and I think one place where we need, and you as journalists need to start at least paying a little bit of attention, because very soon it will be forefront in all climate negotiations. I mean, I'm bombarded by requests to meet with people who want to talk about geoengineering and how this can help, and my thing is, no, if you're going to propose geoengineering to me as really an opportunity to give fossil fuel companies to continue emitting with the promise that this can all be taken out. It's like saying, okay, we can continue to use the atmosphere as a garbage dump, and we'll be able to take that garbage out for you at some point. That is something that is increasingly coming into the discussion. So just something to be aware of, that increasingly you will hear talk of geoengineering in all shapes and forms, capturing carbon and storing it in the ocean, on the ocean floor, and in whose ocean, in whose space. All of these things are things that we have to be aware of.
Okay. So Paula, you'll have that question answered more comprehensively, hopefully towards the end of May, and it's going to be here in Trinidad with the MIC Media Summit. So I want to thank everybody for being here. I don't know if Bianca wants to say anything in wrapping up, but one of the things we want to do before people leave is to do a group shot. Everybody, I forgot to mention it earlier. Bianca, you want to say anything?
I just want to thank everyone again for attending. I hope that it was informative, and it was fantastic to meet everyone here. And I think just my final word is that, I mean, climate change is directly impacting us. We are the canaries in the coal mine, and I do think that we all have a responsibility as educated, informed people to raise awareness and to protect our citizenry and generations to come. So thank you so much for your attention, and it was fantastic to meet all of you. Enjoy your food, mingle, mix, and thank you again.
There's a signal in the back from Isabella. Oh, yes. Well, when I thank participants, I included the Zoom audience. Thanks a lot for staying with us, folks. So the group shot, who's going to set it up?